Hello everyone, welcome back into another stream. Hope you're doing well. So on last night's stream, we finished off watching Smotan's video about the Hornsent and the Crucible. Then we transitioned into Eric's video about etymology, Shadow of the Erdtree names explained. And then we watced Noctigal's Elden Ring Shinto Symphony, America, Radagon, and Divine Parallels. And then finished with Lore Brain's The Real Face of Lord Rykard, Elden Ring Lore. So let me go ahead and get rid of these. Oh, and the prior days. I'm pretty bad at remembering to do this, I guess. And for today, we have first queued up a video by Scum Mage Infa, since we've gotten so many requests, with The Crucible Touched and Their Crucibles, Elden Ring Lore, obviously by Scum Mage Infa. And then following that, since we've been talking about a lot of Norse stuff recently, I figured why not go and try to find a Norse-based lore video, and stumbled across Boris Dragosani's Elden Ring story is Norse mythology, and no DLC spoilers. So that is what I have on schedule for us tonight. So hopefully that'll fill up the time. I think we might end up like ever so slightly early, but I think we should be fine with this. So anyway, Joji Pochi, Pigsy, Stoat Boat, Dave, Jake, nice to have all of you guys again. So, I feel like I'm forgetting something, but anyway. Welcome into the stream, everybody. Let's go ahead and dive on into Scum Mage Infa's The Crucible Touched and Their Crucibles.
The timeline of the Omen has been a tumultuous one. We know that the presence of horns were once considered a blessing, a sign of divinity, and in more recent times, a curse, or something to be reviled and buried. There are multiple reasons why this phenomenon came to be reviled and buried, and this history extends far beyond the simple switching from a blessing to a curse, from evolution to de-evolution, that we see between the Age of the Hornsent and the Age of the Golden Order with their Omen. There are layers, so today I wanted to fully explain this phenomenon and fully explore the tumultuous history of the Crucibles and the Crucible Touched, and what it even means to have been touched by a Crucible. But to understand that, we need to understand what a Crucible is, their function, how they were used, and for what. Understanding the function of something is fundamental to understanding the thing itself. The Crucible most of us know and refer to as the Crucible.
I didn't realize they could hit their allies. What? I want to see that again.
Thing itself. The Crucible most of us know.
That's funny. All right. So I was just thinking about this right now, that it's kind of interesting that the Moog blood-infused Albinorics end up getting horns anyway. So does that mean that the Crucible's latent energy is still stored within Moog's cursed blood, or is it a different kind of thing after all, and or are the Omen meant to be different from the Crucible after all? I guess I'll need to kind of rethink my thoughts about that in the wake of the DLC. And then Jack Irish, nice to see you again. You wonder if the greater whale is darkness because darkness absorbs light, and that's why the Tarnished are so powerful. You absorb everyone's light. So I do think that the Tarnished can act as a vessel for grace or gold or something to that effect. But there is this weird dichotomy between light and darkness within the greater will. I think it's like, if we compare it to like the Big Bang or a supermassive black hole or something like that, there's got to be so much energy latent within it that like not even light can pierce it, perhaps, if we go with the whole like macrocosmic imagery at least. So that might tie into things. But it is very interesting to me that the greater will is described as abyssal, because the abyss in other contexts is something that is lightless, and yet through the greater will it's implied that's how people get their grace. Or maybe you really don't get grace and gold from the greater will after all, and it's just something that's absorbing the gold for itself. But who knows? And then the realist, nice to see you again.
And referred to as the Crucible is the primordial crucible of the Erdtree, which is described as a melting pot, where all life was once blended together. We also know that the Crucible is the primordial form of the Erdtree, which by that definition would mean that the Erdtree is born of the Crucible, or is a more evolved version of it, the final product if you will. Given that, by understanding the function of the Erdtree, perhaps this more advanced, established version of what once was the primordial Crucible can give us insight into the function of a Crucible. The Erdtree itself is somewhat of a melting pot of life. It has two main functions that work towards a single goal, of the greater will supremacy in the lands between. Think of it as breathing in and out to keep ourselves alive. The first function uses the souls of the deceased via the root system, found in the Erdtree burial catacombs and elsewhere, absorbing and processing them, by taking them in their pure form and then expelling them after they have been imbued with the will of the greater will. While I believe in the earlier stages of its formation in the...
Yeah, I don't know if they are being imbued with the will of the greater will, as much as it is just like the energies of the deceased, I suppose. But, you know, a lot of this stuff is arguable. And it's because of the way that the Elden Ring kind of takes in the bodies of the dead and reproduces sap from them, which made me believe that it was possible that it could act as like a great filter from which life would originate from at that point. But it is always annoying trying to parse through the Crucible stuff. But anyway. And hey, little church lore.
The Erdtree's sap, before it dried up, was really just the reprocessed souls of those sacrificed to it or who returned to it, gifted to Marika's strongest warriors to make them even stronger and potentially subservient, literally imbibing the strength and will of the greater will. I believe we see its main function as an effect in-game, as the lands between is periodically bathed in these leaves, a physical representation of the influence of the greater will and its Erdtree, fittingly granting a boon of more runes upon slaying an enemy. Its second function is that it acts as a house for the Elden Ring or Elden Beast, which is the conduit in the lands between of the greater will. This beast or ring is imbued with aspects of the laws of reality, which are amplified and imposed on reality by this process. The essence of the deceased being brought to this powerhouse where the beast imparts its will upon that essence, which is then dispersed to the lands between. I guess a good analogy would be the Infinity Gauntlet, or perhaps the One Ring from the Lord of the Rings, exerting...
And some of this stuff is obviously more headcanon. It's not explained as explicitly as that, and so there might be margin for error if we ever get more info about this.
Control on all else and the souls of those connected to it, with Marika being Sauron. So if we boil that down to its bare bones, or rather view it in a more primal, basic, primordial form, the Erdtree is essentially a melting pot of life, used to achieve something grand in nature, in this case being the supremacy of the Golden Order and Greater Will via imprinting and amplifying its will on reprocessed souls, which are then distributed back to the lands between. If the primordial Crucible was a melting pot of life, wherein many forms were sacrificed to pave the way for the creation of the Erdtree, a more advanced version of this mechanism with extra quirks, that would tick the box for the Crucible being a melting pot of life and also being used to achieve something grand in nature, this time around being the creation of the Erdtree from the primordial Crucible. So with that in mind, I would define a Crucible in general as a method or technology used to create substantial power from the death of life, either naturally or artificially occurring, and capable of prompting events grand in nature and greatly varied in scale, such as powering a tool of war, ascending an...
And I pretty much agree with a lot of this right here, especially when taken in conjunction with things like the Regal Ancestors spirits or something else relating to the Regal Ancestors, which says like from death, hold on. Something about life, then from death one obtains power. Anyway.
Individual to godhood, piercing the veil between realms such as the Outer Realm and the Lands Between, and the Lands Between and the Shadow Realm, and even exerting your will over an entire civilization and reality itself. I think this is best summed up by the item description of the talisman, the ancestral spirit horns, which read, "Number of new growths bud from the antler-like horns of the fallen king, each glowing with light. Thus does new life grow from death.
Hey, he got the quote.
And from death, one obtains power." And in its essence, that is what a crucible is. A mechanism of extracting power from life via death. Mass death, naturally occurring or artificially prompted. That power then being used to achieve X, Y, or Z, either naturally resulting in, for example, the summoning of an outer god to the lands between, due to an event of mass death weakening the veil between worlds, or calculatedly directed by whoever prompted the crucible as a tool to achieve their goals. You may have heard me refer to the crucible not as the crucible, but a crucible. That is because there are in fact multiple crucibles that come in more crude and naturally occurring forms, and more organized and calculated forms, with differing but similar in nature after effects, and the same principal result, the creation of power. This would mean while the fundamental...
So it does annoy me that he says there are in fact multiple crucibles, which he might be right about, but I feel like this is one of those things that's very arguable and a little bit more prone to individual interpretation than to state things so plainly there.
The concept of generating power would be the same. The method of achieving mass death and the intended result or purpose could vary as much as the entities prompting them. I would categorize crucibles as
Well, now that I think about it, within the context of his point earlier, I could see what he means about there being multiple crucibles, but this just kind of goes back into just the actual language that's being used in Elden Ring. And of course, the Japanese doesn't really distinguish a singular crucible from multiple ones. However, the English doesn't help us in entertaining the idea of multiple crucibles beyond perhaps the arguments about like the mother of all crucibles or something like that, or like the everything crucible in Japanese. Anyway, and then SNX, nice to see you again.
Falling into either one of the two below, naturally occurring crucibles that result from a natural event resulting in mass death. The power resulting from these is not directed for a specific cause, but can prompt grand events. Artificially occurring crucibles artificially created by channeling mass death. The power resulting from this is directed for a specific cause. These crucibles can be large in scale and impact an entire civilization and land, or localized and affect one person and their immediate area, even small scale to the tune of individuals. I'll run through a few examples for the context of these vast variations, and if they interest you and you want to know more, I'll link a video with further possible examples of crucibles in the description.
Cool. So I don't know who's the dyslexic between Teen Sith or myself, but I read that as though you said you're doing Crucible prep right now. I'm like, oh, okay, you're getting ready for the Crucible? Don't know what you mean, but then I reread that and you said cuticle prep. So, did you mean Crucible? You doing a Crucible night run?
A great example of a large artificial crucible would be the Erdtree's Crucible, its primordial form. This was artificially created.
Alright, so hold on. I want to read these. And he's got some, for anybody who's just listening along, he's got some text appearing on the Erdtree door. The bottom right now, where the opening is, like the roots kind of seem to burned away, says, "The roots represent the foundations, the primordial crucible created of mass death." And then at the top right, it says, "The story of this process from Crucible to Erdtree is likely recorded here on the Erdtree door." So then...
be the Erdtree's Crucible, its primordial form. This was...
Now we've got some text going up by the Elden Ring part, which says, "The Elden Ring / Beast lands and is imbued into this Crucible."
Was artificially created, I would argue, by...
And then going up towards like the tree depiction, it says, "The beast brings order and structure to its form, growing the Erdtree for its use to spread its influence."
Sacrifice in the battles of Marika's first Elden Lord and Crucible Knight.
And then above that, the Erdtree as we know it, built on the primordial crucible, which may have even been a tree itself, possibly the great tree, given the item description of Spoliers tree.
It's fueled by the life offered to it, as explored in my previous.
Alright, so now that I've read all that, I'm going to back it up so that way I can actually pay attention to what he was saying during that. And then, hey, Global Sequence, nice to see you again. And Muramasa, welcome on in. Am I going to watch his new video, Godwin the Malformed Dragon? Not tonight. So, because of the way YouTube works, I prefer to at least wait like a week for somebody's videos to go live, unless it like mentions me for whatever reason. And so that way it gets some time in the algorithm, and it doesn't seem like I'm trying to divert like search results away from the original video and whatnot. So maybe in like a week or so.
Artificial crucible would be the Erdtree's Crucible.
And I also thought it'd be a good idea to start with some of his older work in case he like, you know, starts referencing it in his newer stuff.
Its primordial form. This was artificially created, I would argue, by sacrifice in the battles of Marika's first Elden Lord and Crucible Knights, fueled by the life offered to it. As explored in my previous video, I found the missing inhabitants.
Damn it, we didn't watch that one. Alright, so let me back it up again because I didn't go as far back as I wanted. I do have some thoughts about whether or not the Crucible existed when the Elden Ring landed, but I think within Scummage Infa's cosmology here, for a lack of a better term, and him trying to differentiate like the Crucible from Crucibles, there might be some more stuff going on with this. And then without horns, nice to see you again.
And if they interest you and you want to know more, I'll link a video with further possible examples of crucibles in the description. A great example of a large artificial crucible would be the Erdtree's Crucible, its primordial form. This was artificially created, I would argue, by sacrifice in the battles of Marika's first Elden Lord and Crucible Knights, fueled by the life offered to it. As explored in my previous video, I found the missing inhabitants of the nameless Eternal City. The denizens of this city could have also been used to sacrifice and build the primordial crucible of the Erdtree.
So he's thinking of the ant corpses are the Eternals, so to speak. And this video was made only 1 month ago, so after the DLC had released, for like about a month.
At the very least, give it a massive power boost. I'll be exploring this in much further depth in my next video as a sort of revision to my prior video, but with DLC knowledge. Anyway, this was not done for the benefit of a single individual, but the purpose of the greater will establishing supremacy in the lands between. A civilizational directive. Another example of a large artificial crucible with a similar but different purpose would be the Divine Gate, which I believe to be the greater will's attempt to use the technology of a crucible to establish and maintain connection with the population it would rule over, and ascend its chosen ruler. An earlier or just different version of the function of the Erdtree, the Erdtree having a larger host of abilities, being a more refined application of the crucible technique. In the case of the Divine Gate and many crucibles, if not all of them, is the power generated from mass death being used to pierce or weaken the veil between our world and the outer world, or the lands between and the Shadow Realm. In this case...
So yeah, I would not necessarily agree that the Divine Gate was kind of made by the greater will itself. While that's a possibility, it's just one of those statements where there's not really any textual support for it as far as I know.
It was so that the greater will could more greatly exert its influence and in some ways cross over. I would argue that this is also likely shown as well by the Rot Crucible, possibly being where the outer god of Rot was not only sealed, but gained entry into the lands between, sent back to whence it came. After all, Rot is...
So now I am starting to get annoyed by just carte blanche saying the Rot Crucible. He's just kind of adding Crucible to whatever to support his points. And while I could kind of understand why he would say that Rot could act as a Crucible, it does annoy me that he's not trying to substantiate his claims other than just stating them factually.
Described as a divine element of the outer gods, and it itself acts almost like a liquid form of the crucible, melting everything down into the same thing. if there was a giant...
See, if he led with that before just factually stating it was a rot crucible, I could be like, okay, I see what you're saying with that. And part of the reason why I get so pedantic about stuff like this is because of so many years talking to people in the lore community who have many misconceptions because of hearing things which are very obviously headcanon stated as fact and then believing it because they don't know the lore very well. So it just gets very tiresome very quickly when you can see the sources of such things happening in real time.
Giant pile of bodies in this location, say from a runoff of a mass sacrifice of an eternal city that happened some time ago, and or a crucible building an Erdtree, you'd expect this conglomeration of bodies to rot. For further information on this, I again point you to my video regarding the denizens of the nameless eternal city. The ultimate method of fermentation, akin to the potentate's jarring process of pickling rotten flesh and parts. The aspect of the Crucible Thorn's incantation reads, in an age-long past, before this land was enshrouded in shadow, the vitality of the Crucible flourished. Remains of this can be seen in the ancient ruins. I would argue the remains of what is referred to as the vitality of the Crucible is rot, which is found in the ancient ruins outside of the Church of Bud, home to the Rot Saint. This would further make sense as to why rot is considered to be a divine element. Interestingly, this would also mean Melania is essentially a portable nuclear reactor, or rather crucible creator, as her bloom spreads the divine element of rot, melting all together, creating bestial entities, and I will speak much more to this soon enough, and create skyward structures from the melding of these corpses that will one day reach the gods, like the Crucible of Caelid. To further support the idea of crucibles being used to pierce the veil between worlds, the blood crucible of Miquella's cocoon in Mohgwyn is being used to allow Miquella to travel to the land of shadows. Mohg is using his own radioactive accursed blood and is getting bloody fingers to kill fellow Tarnished and use their blood to turn Mohgwyn into a crucible of mass death and blood for the cocoon, bathing the cocoon and allowing Miquella to pierce the veil between our lands and the Shadowlands. I also think it's no coincidence that Melania Bloom...
There's a lot going on with the Mohgwyn stuff, especially related to the Outer God, the Mother of Truth, which I need to think more about in relation to the way that some of Mohg's fingers, like Okina, have blood flame on their attacks, and I've wondered for a long time whether or not the blood flame within the rivers of blood was just merely the byproduct of Okina killing so many people and causing them to bleed. And why I'm bringing this up now in relation to the Crucible is I'm not sure if death necessarily went hand in hand with bleeding people and the connection to the Mother of Truth and like blood flame. So that isn't to say that it isn't Crucible-like in a different kind of way, which I'm not trying to say that Scum Age Info is trying to say that, oh, like the blood flame stuff is the exact same as Scarlet Rot, don't get me wrong, but I don't know. I just want to think about it more. Captini might be the Crucible. You consume flesh of living beings to create 2 children. My condolences or congratulations, your pick. And Pixie's honestly pretty lost. You think it's because there's a lot of terminology being used. Some is in game, some is not, and it's all getting mixed in. That's an interesting point. So you were here at the beginning, weren't you? Yeah. So I think part of it is because they're running with their alternative definition for the Crucible, and because they're already so familiar with their thought, this isn't really that big of a deal to them. But for those who might not be as familiar with that idea of the Crucible as it's being presented here, it might be a little bit more difficult trying to differentiate the Crucible as it pertains to the Crucible Knights versus this more disambiguated idea that he's sharing of a vessel adjacent container of death in which life kind of gets renewed from death melding together and whatnot. The old melting pot type thing. And then Stoatboat asks, what really is Bloodflame and the reason for the Mother of Truth sadomasochism? Is it allegory to passion? That's a really good question. I have wondered whether or not, unironically, the Shadow Tree is supposed to be related to the Mother of Truth's power, and if there was a tree before the Great Tree, or if like the Shadow Tree had a more full version, if it was more specifically related to her. Partially because of the one description which tells us that it's an edict from the Shadow Tree to spurn and wound all that it exists, for it has been abandoned. And that might be kind of analogous to what's going on with Moog as well, because he was sort of abandoned by America Underground for all intents and purposes. And so I was wondering whether or not that was part of the connection that Mikola needed to go into the Shadow Realm. But it just really sucks that we don't have an actual canonical time for when we enter the Shadow Realm, because it seems like we are supposed to be Elden Lord by the point we enter the Shadow Realm, and if that's the case, it should imply that the Erdtree has already been burned. But if you're anything like me and played through the DLC before killing the Fire Giant, then that it's a little bit awkward that he calls you the Lord of the New Order. And for anybody who's wondering, like, doesn't he just say the aspiring Lord of the Old Order? And I think I just misspoke a moment ago. As far as the Japanese goes, he just says that you're the Lord of the Old Order. So nothing about aspiring. Thank you, Little Chorchlore. I don't remember what I said about what's a good point. Okay, yeah, Global Sequence probably summarized it a bit better than me right there, and thank you for that, and nice to see you again. In that they think Infa's argument is that Crucibles are mass sacrifices with some sort of religious intent. And I guess he's saying that the Eternal Folk were the mass sacrifice for Rot? I don't know if mass sacrifice is with religious intent is a necessary component, but perhaps like mass sacrifice or mass death may be sufficient, but yes. And then Realist asks, does Millennia call us a lord? No, so because Millennia is in the base game, all of that base game stuff is pertinent to the base game, and so she just says you have the strength of a lord, like extraordinary, but she doesn't say that like we are a lord, we're just like good enough to be one in her blind eyes. But okay.
Loomed directly above where Mikola's cocoon is, creating yet another crucible above it. I would hypothesize this was to power the cocoon to allow us to travel to the realm of shadow, as Mikola once did. I explore that further in my previous video.
So that one I don't like as much because he's doubling up the whole Crucible thing to make a point which I don't really think is strengthened by the way it's presented right here. So yeah, I think it's fine enough to just have like the Moog stuff be the Moog stuff and the Rot stuff be the Rot stuff if you want to go with the whole like Crucible imagery. But now it's a little bit awkward combining two different elements, especially when they're controlled by like different outer gods and whatnot. But who knows?
If you're interested, Mikola's Great Escape. Yet another example of crucibles are those used for the ascension of a singular individual to godhood, such as Rykard's chambers in the Volcano Manor, where, just as at the sites of other crucibles, we see bodies embedded into the very pillars, as described by the Spira incantation to represent normalized crucible currents stretching to the gods. And Rykard's goals are just that, to reach and devour them, melding together as family with his men, a blending pot of life for the sole purpose of devouring the gods, who it would seem he intends to make a crucible of. Quite blasphemous. Just as in both of these instances, just as the Omen and their horn stemming from the aspect of the Erdtree's crucible, and every other example of a crucible I have provided, and I fully intend to back that statement up, we see bestial elements also appear in the denizens surrounding these crucibles. such as the familiar horns beginning to sprout on the Albinorics that have been close to the Blood Crucible, or the snake men of the Volcano Manor and their serpentine features, much like the Godskin apostles and nobles' bodies, who are said to be similar in composition and nature to the Crucible itself. I just wanted to reassure those potentially squirming that I haven't heavily noted on that yet to rest assured. I will be exploring these side effects and their ubiquitous presence near these crucibles after a few more examples, just to really hammer home how crucible technology has been adapted, used, and transformed, and that it comes in all shapes and sizes, such as small artificial crucibles. I believe the horrific practices of the horn scent were an attempt to minimize this technology even further. Given the jar shape, I would guess in...
I'm a little bit lost there. What does he mean by minimize the technology?
A few more examples, just to really hammer home how crucible technology has been adapted, used, and transformed, and that it comes in all shapes and sizes, such as small artificial crucibles. I believe the horrific practices of the horn scent were an attempt to minimize this technology.
So I think he means minimize in a literal sense rather than like a figurative, like reduce the amount of crucible technology or like use of crucible technologies. He literally means making it smaller. I get it now.
Even further, given the jar shape, I would guess in reference to the crucible of the Giant's Forge, a giant melting pot of life. I would guess, given the proximity and relevance to the Hornsent ruins, that Romina was a successful such experiment. The Saint of Rot. Akin to the aforementioned Saint of Rot, the Hornsent implement a method of...
Oh no. So... I totally get where he's coming from with this. I guess I never really considered it, although I think somebody brought it up to me once and I just didn't think about it because it was too, like, evident for me to really consider how important it was. All right, so let's go ahead and pull out the spreadsheet. So as far as Ramina's name is concerned, she's the Saint of the Bud, and here we have Seijo, which means Holy Woman, aka Saint, whereas the Saint of the Condemned is... Okay, right here, like, good people? Yokihito? Bito? I don't really know how you conjugate this, or not conjugate, but anyway. So... the jar saints aren't the same kind of saint as Ramana, so I can understand why if somebody thought that the jar saints were like literally saints, that it could potentially tie into Ramana, and that's definitely not something I considered just because of like knowing the difference. So the thought just really hadn't crossed my mind. So that's kind of an interesting idea. It's just a little bit unfortunate that it doesn't work. Well, it doesn't work as well with the Japanese text, I should say.
Blending life and leaving it to rot, or ferment, pickle, if you will, to become a saint, a crucible saint, a saint of rot. I'll be releasing a video on where the Hornsent fit into this timeline, which will help explain their mimicry of the Grand Crucibles further, but I just wanted to offer an example of how small this technique, method, or technology, if you will, can get. In this same vein, the Furnace Golem Wickermen themselves are a crude implementation of this technology or mechanism to create a weapon. Mobile melting pots of life using the power of death to power them, demonstrating yet another application of this principle and technology. Returning to the item description.
Something about that feels a bit more off to me. Maybe it's because I tend to look at the Wickermen as automatons rather than like constructs which continue to produce life, which is what the Crucible seemed to be. So I'm kind of against that idea, but I can't really give a super good reason as to why. So I wonder if you guys feel the same.
Description found on the ancestral beast horns, I believe we can see a crucible, as it were, in a smaller and more naturally occurring way, in the ancestral beasts and their corpse-strewn chambers. These beasts draw power from the death of life, were like small portable crucibles, as seen in their boss chambers, which are littered with the spirits of the deceased animals collected in their chambers, who were processed by the ancestral beasts and used to grant them power, or life, to heal them.
You know what? I guess I never really thought about this. Does that work? Alright, given the ancestral followers, Spirit Bomb, give me your energy attack, could the, like, literal Crucible, the Erdtree Crucible type thing have had something similar going on? So perhaps before the Age of America, if there was a tree like that, could it have absorbed the souls that were, like, kind of latently floating around the lands between / land of shadow, and then used it as some kind of, like, energy source? So rather than just, I mean, maybe it's all just a root thing and that's the difference between an animal and a tree, but just thinking about it. Think about how the ancestral spirit changes its moveset according to the most recent spirit it absorbed. Yeah, and I think this idea in general is extremely similar to Divine Invocation. Which, it's weird to me that the new, what are they called? The new Horn Talismans are continuations of the ancestral ones. Just because, to me, it honestly seems like they should be talking about different things. But because if this thing avoided the purview of the Erdtree, was it compatible with the Crucible? Did the Crucible not interfere with stuff like this? It's vexing. The Stalwart Horn Charms? Yeah, we've got a couple one. There's like 3 variants, but yes. Okay.
Their wounds, melding together with them. The above examples, of course, aren't the only things crucibles would be used for. Their applications are vast, as we see in other crucibles, such as the Crucible of the Dragons in Farum Azula, and the many natural oddities occurring there, potentially also Placidus Sax's attempt to contact its god, or the Crucible of the Giants and the lands between itself, where the all-crucible talisman, donning innumerable bestial and...
So I was hoping he was going to elaborate on what he considers the Crucible of the Dragons, and I was gonna like let him talk, because I've cut him off a couple times where he's finally like elaborated, but now I feel like I'm left hanging, and if he goes back into it right after this, I'm just going to throw my hands up in exasperation.
And insectoid aspects is said to have originated. Just quickly to note, I know how many of you will be thinking this refers to the fire giants and their ilk. However, I'm referring to the giants we see embedded in the lands between, akin to the dragons of Farum Azula. I believe that they are the true, original giants, from whom the All Crucibles talisman sprouted. And the fire giants we see today are basically trolls to the original giants, in the same way trolls are to the fire giants. To summarize...
And I've wondered whether or not it would make more sense for the giants that have more Crucible-style horns or growths, if those would be the ones that we find in the Shadowkeep specimen storeroom. So there is a decent amount of ambiguity surrounding the whole giant connection.
This section as an analogy that I'll be using moving forward. Think of the power created by a crucible as nuclear power, and the crucible itself, the source of this nuclear power, a nuclear reactor. This could take form as a nuclear power plant that powers a city, or like the nuclear batteries in cars in Fallout, or down to a singular maintenance robot, and so on. To extend that analogy, what would happen to someone who is exposed to the process of creating nuclear energy? What would happen to those people if nuclear reactors had no safety regulations? They would be exposed to nuclear radiation, and this would cause mutations in their genes. The talisman of all crucibles is an intermingling of innumerable bestial aspects. We see wings, horns, insect parts, scales, a whole host of beast-like attributes, all intermingled. While this itself is a fantastic demonstration of the mutations that arise from crucibles, the aspect of the crucible's incantations themselves are an extensive demonstration of these bestial aspects. What gives rise to these mutations appears to be related to what is used in the creation of the respective crucible, a pattern that you see begin to emerge. I'll confirm this quickly by running through a list of crucibles and their accompanying mutations surrounding their proximity. The primordial crucible.
So yeah, Teen Sith and I have been on the whole radiation analogy train for quite a while, in that if the vital forces of life are just kind of represented as an intangible force, then what does it mean for those people in the lands between to come in direct contact with that intangible force? Does it cause them to mutate? Does that explain such things like the misbegotten or even the kindred of rot? I don't know if I would compare the kindred of rot to like the crucible mentioned in the game directly, but I do think the principle is similar indeed to what is going on with Scarlet Rot itself. So, Elden enthusiast, nice to see you again. You've wondered if the Mother of Crucible talismans refer to the misbegotten and their origins instead. As giants? I mean, I would like to believe that, but I just don't think it works. Let me try to find it again. Forget how it's actually worded. Mother of Crucibles. Talisman of all Crucibles. Okay. Yeah, I just can't really see the misbegotten being giants. Yeah, I don't know. Captini said that Talisman does give some Annihilation vibes. Annihilation books kind of fits this idea of the Crucible. Now that you think about it, Annihilation is very similar to Elden Ring's Crucible. Elden says, if they're connected to Radagon, and if Radagon is a giant, it's wonky, but who knows? And if they're his kids, I hate it. Get lost. Hey, I'm gay. Nice to see you again.
Crucible and the Horned Omen. My guess is that the Horn Scent was sacrificed in this crucible. The Erdtree and the Flower People. Perhaps the Great Tree or Skardu Tree was used in its creation. Faramazula and the Drakes, such as Bale, with both serpentine features such as no front legs, feathers, more reptilian scales, and extra horns on the drake.
I'm going to back it up. I don't think he actually explained it the way that I wanted him to, so I'm a little bit floundering right now, but it certainly didn't help that I paused and whatnot.
They begin to emerge. I'll confirm this quickly by running through a list of crucibles and their accompanying mutations surrounding their proximity. The primordial crucible and the Horned Omen. My guess is that the Horn Scent was sacrificed in this crucible. The Erdtree and the Flower People.
Hold on, that the Omen were sacrificed? Oh, Horn
Scent was sacrificed in this crucible. The Erdtree and the Flower People.
Okay, I'm following.
Perhaps the Great Tree or Skardu Tree was used in its creation. Faramazula and the Drakes, such.
So I'm assuming he's just saying the storm is the crucible, I guess, or maybe the Beastmen being sacrificed. I guess it would have been nice if that's what he meant more, and highlighted that. But anyway.
Such as Bale, with both serpentine features such as no front legs, feathers, more reptilian scales, and extra horns on the drakes, who I would liken to the omen of the dragon, and many on Bale, who I would liken to the Morgoth or Moog of the dragons. Given the sheer amount of mutations we see on Bale, I would imagine everything was sacrificed in their crucible at one point. The Crucible of Enir.
I would like more to go along with that, because that's just it doesn't really connect to anything as far as I know.
The Divine Gate and the Horn Scent, who I have no doubt sacrificed.
Wait, is he double dipping? The Crucible of Enir. Okay. Okay, I see what he's saying.
The Divine Gate and the Horn Scent, who I have no doubt sacrificed themselves, or perhaps spiritual beasts, to their crucible. The rot crucibles and the kindred of rot. Bugs tend to show up around rotting food. The blood crucible and the horned albinorics and sanguine nobles. This crucible was made using Mohg's radioactive blood, his accursed blood, having crucible properties, reflecting on the horned albinorics, the crucible of Rykard's chamber, and the serpentine men whose bodies and movements is similar to the godskin nobles, whose form is said to be similar in nature to the crucible itself.
So this is the second time you said the Crucible of Rykard's chamber, and I'm just a little bit surprised that he doesn't liken Rykard himself to a crucible in the way that he consumes his victims and like has their souls get integrated into his body. Although maybe that goes against the idea of like the mass sacrifice, but anyway. Little Church Lore was asking, what are the red eyes found on various creatures? So this has kind of been a stable thing since the time of Demon Souls, maybe even earlier, where for whatever reason, when a character has red eyes, they tend to have higher pools of health and can hit a little bit harder than enemies of the same type and variety. And they didn't go... Well, I guess they kind of did still use that idea in Elden Ring, but in Elden Ring, they wanted to have that tie into like the Flame of Frenzy in some early drafts, but they didn't go through with it entirely, which is perfectly fine. And there are still some remnants of it, but it's just kind of handled really inconsistently because I don't know if Grail's red-eyed beasts or red-eyed dragons are the product of her screams or if they're just normally red-eyed. That's also been a thing in FromSoft games where if they get buffed by an ally, enemies can have like the color of their eyes change and whatnot. I think there's a Scourge Beast in Old Yarnum that has like a Screaming Beast patient in the fog alleyway when you're going to fight the blood-starved beast that its eye color can change. But I don't really remember if I actually tested that, despite saying I should do that like years and years ago. So, in Dark Souls and whatnot, if an enemy had red eyes, as I said before, they just had like more health. And I think the general idea was to show that they had like a little bit more will or more anger or something going on to explain that kind of shonen power boost. And then Global Sequence says, yeah, at night, the demi-human's eyes glow red. And in Elden Ring, we have like a red-eyed Banish Knight in Castle Sol that is a tanky boy and can do a ton of damage. So it still does exist to a smaller degree in Elden Ring as well. Alright.
The Crucible of the Ancestral Beasts, and the Ancestral Followers, and the Horned Beasts. The Crucible of the Potentate Jars and the Fly People, since their method is more akin to rot by fermenting and pickling their injured, poisoned, rotting victims. Their affliction is more akin to the bug-like kindred of rot. Flies tend to show up around rotting flesh. This is also the same for the Crucible.
I don't know if the horn scent were poisoning themselves or like their compatriots to turn into flies intentionally, despite the conspiracy theory idea that the people with the bandages could have been infecting the horn scent. But I feel like that one is probably like the weakest example of a crucible so far.
Crucible of Putrescence, or the Crucible of Death, given there are innumerable small bugs coming from Godwyn, though we do also see fish and reptile associations with this as well, which may speak to its entirely unnatural state. Either that, or the aspects we see here are bestial eyes.
Just the timing of MK's comment with this image is pretty great.
Which sprout on everything afflicted with death blight. Speaking of death, the death birds themselves almost seem akin to the Wicker Men, with corpses embedded into their wings, powering them, and their bestial form. The Crucible of the Lands Between, formed from the giants from which the All Crucibles talisman is said to have sprung.
Yeah, again, I get where he's going with the Wicker Man comparison, but I don't think that works because the Wicker Men need the fire to operate, whereas, I mean, sure, maybe you could say the same thing about the Ghost Birds or the death birds, if they didn't have ghost flame, they'd still operate, but for some reason, I think that is like more of a one-to-one thing with the death birds. Well, no, because you do have death birds, but not deathrite birds who don't necessarily have ghost flame at all. So maybe the idea does pan out. Actually, I wonder, do death birds have people growing in them, or is it just... Let me look. Because I know I have a clip of its scar, but I don't know if I like zoomed in on whether it had people in it. Limgrave. Which one is this? Okay, so this is a normal death bird. I don't think I did a super close up on this guy. Okay, no, we definitely have a guy on the inside there. This little thing right there is one of those priests. Yep, priest face. Okay, so even the base forms of the death birds have the priests in them, but not their wings. It's interesting. Captini kind of gets what this video is trying to say about many crucibles. Like back when there was only one crucible, life used to be more varied but less distinct. Now that there's many, it's more. Uh-oh, looks like Elden Ring's finally coming around to the idea. Okay, I get what you're saying. All right, let's go back to the video.
Is embedded into their wings, powering them, and their bestial form. The Crucible of the Lands Between, formed from the giants from which the All Crucibles talisman is said to have sprung, and all life with it. I would even argue the Crucible of Madness, which is mass death that was capable of summoning the Three Fingers into the Lands Between, the envoy of Frenzied Flame, the afflicted being the maddened, their mutation being one of the mind. To summarize and reiterate my previous...
Is that fair to compare the Frenzied Flame to it? Because the Frenzied Flame burns away the spirit. It seems like it shouldn't necessarily be getting more power as a byproduct of melting things. Although maybe if you say it gets melted together, then it doesn't really matter, and it's kind of absorbing it that way. I don't know.
Analogy, a crucible is like a nuclear reactor, and the curses or blessings that result in the population near or involved with these crucibles, and the crucible touched, are genetic mutations, akin to those created by radiation after exposure to nuclear energy. In this case, exposure to these crucibles, and the power they are used to create. A really funny example that pays homage to this analogy are the almost radioactively glowing horned owls, and their totally not glowing, hornless counterparts. The perspectives around these mutations have changed throughout time, and since we now know what a crucible is, what it can be used for, and what it means to be touched by the crucible, let's explore the histories of these mutations and see how and why they've changed throughout the timeline, including between different factions of the crucible touched toward each other. Placidusax is the first Elden Lord we have in recorded history, as recorded on the Old Lord's Talisman, an artifact crafted in the likeness of Placidusax in his apex, donning all four heads.
Did he just have like Placidusax just spliced in from different audio? It's kind of funny.
It is said Placidusax was Elden Lord in a time before the Erdtree, and there are no other items describing an Elden Lord before them. In an age before the Erdtree and the Golden Order and their revulsion of Omen, before even the Hornsent and their age of supremacy worshipping the Omen, or Horn Chosen, the Lands Between was ruled over by the ancient dragons, chosen race of the Outer God, the Greater Will, whose Elden Lord Placidusax was Lord, I would argue, to Meta. While, yes, this is mostly speculation, as the records from this time are ancient and far few and in between, I find it particularly interesting that the gifts granted to the minions of Farum Azula that granted them intelligence appear to be their fingers, as per the description of Sinkadia. And I think by this point we're all pretty familiar with which outer god has a thing for fingers. In addition to this, we know that Placidusax's god fled after suffering a great loss. I would wager this great loss was the defeat of Placidusax and Meta at the hands of the Drakes and Baal. This great loss resulting in Placidusax losing 2 of its heads, and Meta being gashed and not being able to birth perfect children anymore. The fingers she produces after receiving this wound being broken and twisted, leading to her being abandoned by the Greater Will. After Meta fled to protect itself, Placidusax was removed beyond time using Farum Azula as a crucible to try and contact its outer god for direction.
So, even though it kind of sounds like I'm not complaining about the video, it's more just like, if Meter was indeed Placidusax's god, then how does that really fit in with the Gate of Divinity? And maybe this just goes back into my crackpot theory, indeed, that what happens at the Divine Gate in the story trailer might happen a lot later in the timeline than people would initially expect, because the way that it's set up, it makes it seem as though it should be when Marika is ascending with Godfrey, but there might unironically be the possibility that it's instead the time when she ascends with Radagon. And I guess Meter could have already been defeated then. So anyway, like, the issue is, where does the separation between Meter and Placidusax start? Then why is she all of a sudden in the Hornsent place, if she's there at all? And how do you reconcile a lot of this stuff? Like, it's not irreconcilable, don't get me wrong. It's just kind of messy, I think, no matter what somebody's interpretation is. Wouldn't we get God slain when we kill her? That's a really good point. It is arguable that she doesn't die. She might just, like, poof away of her own accord and not die. But to be fair, we get a remembrance from her, and doesn't it say, like, Legendfeld or something like that? So, yeah. She is just fled. Well, that might apply to Meter too, now that you mention it that way, yeah. MK says, St. Trina says divinity is a cage. Meter doesn't have that vibe, in your opinion, to be a caged god like Marika has. Well, I mean, it seems as though Meter is kind of stuck where she is until you blow the whistles, so maybe it is a bit of a cage. But yeah, that line about divinity being a cage is very interesting. Because it makes a little bit more sense in the context of Marika, because we do kind of see her imprisoned within the Erdtree, but of course that doesn't mesh super well with the idea that she was out wandering about in the lands between. So, why would it have been a cage for Mikola, as opposed to existing as a demigod? Like, why is being a god that much worse, according to Trina?
Meta herself was broken and abandoned in the Shadow Realm and remained hidden in some form of pocket dimension, awaiting a signal from the Greater Will that never came. While this story is frankly enthralling, I'll be dedicating an entire video to exploring this context, and will be further researching the relationship between these parties, so watch this space. But my goal for explaining that was not to even argue the specifics of Meta's possible relationship with Placidusax, which I'm frankly fine on being wrong
with Placidusax, it's just every time now.
About, but instead the existence of the Holy City of the Dragons, Farum Azula, as a crucible, which, mind you, shares striking similarities to any Ilim, such as the architecture, the denizens moulding into the constructs and the land itself, and the fact that it's never night here, no matter what time of the day, perhaps placing it beyond time like Farum Azula. We also arrive in Farum Azula after burning the Erdtree, and we arrive in Eni Ilim after burning the Sealing Tree. I believe just like Eni Ilim and the Divine Gate, Farum Azula was initially created for the dragons and potentially Meta to convene with the Outer God, the Greater Will. Or perhaps it was powered by these sacrifices for Meta to communicate with the Greater Will, as Placidusax is found attempting to do. As a result of this Crucible's initial creation, when it was used to communicate and not to flee, the dragons themselves were exposed to the Crucible, resulting in mutations. The horned, scaled, and legless drakes, and then eventually the Moog and Morgoth omen equivalent of the dragons.
So yeah, that was an idea that I'd wondered a long time ago, whether or not the drakes were altered by the Crucible, which in my opinion could have just been like Godfrey's Erdtree. And I don't really think that fully works out as much as I would have wanted it to. It does bring up a lot of more pain points with the line about the ice dragons sharing the peaks with the fire giants back in the day in Borealis' Mist. But it is written as hearsay, at least in Japanese, so there was a little bit more wiggle room to work with that, but it just kind of sucks trying to convince English-only players about that. And at the end of the day, it's just like a lot of things to support something which isn't all that important unless you're really trying to make a point about like the dragons relating to the Crucible itself. So I'm very surprised that he thinks that the dragons themselves are altered by what I'm assuming he's calling here is like the primordial Crucible, which would be like the one mentioned in the Crucible aspect, or the Crucible Knight set, I guess.
Bale. Regardless of the reason, be it that the Omen dragons were persecuted, perhaps born without the timeless scales of their counterparts, and embittered like Seath from Dark Souls, or perhaps something more simple, like the murder of one's mother, there was civil war and mutual defeat. The ancient dragons fleeing somewhere beyond time, where the usurper could not reach them, and the drakes and Bale scattered through the lands between, two forces with leaders too grievously injured to lead them, falling to ruin as a civilization. Therein lies the introduction of the first power dynamic between the mutated and the originals, the perspective being mutual hatred at best, resulting in oblivion of both sides, or potentially outright prejudice.
So one of the issues that I have with saying that the dragons created a crucible to potentially talk to the greater will is, aside from like the lack of textual support, one of my questions is what's in it for the dragons? Like, we don't really have much of a dragon greater will connection as much as we do like a Beastmen one with the Cinque Dea, but maybe that's enough depending on one's thoughts about Farum Azula and the ancient dragons specifically. But it seems to me the dragons coming into contact with the Crucible is them taking a big L, and other things kind of getting a dub, potentially from absorbing what should have been primarily draconic power from way back when. But yeah, I don't know. And then Captini was asking, does being a god bind you to something? Like other gods are bound to aspects of the Bloodstar or Rot. Would Marika or Mikola ascend even more if their godhood went fully through? So we don't really know if Mikola is beholden to an outer god. We also don't know if he's beholden to any fingers. There is the possibility that he may have had two fingers with Millennia, and their two fingers itself has died somehow in the Divine Tower, which is like, why is Ronnie's the only two fingers which are still alive? I have no idea. I wonder if it has anything to do with like destined death. So could have like breaking the Elden Ring have made time move forward for the fingers, but it wasn't going forward before? I don't know. Anyway, I guess the closest thing that you could say that a god would be bound to would be the vision that they have for the Elden Ring or the world or whatnot, but that's kind of just my best guesstimate. Out a god of eternal childhood? I kind of think he gets beyond that, to be honest. Obviously, he's not as big as Radahn, but he isn't quite as childlike as I think he's portrayed in other depictions of himself in like the Erdtree. And then Kyle, nice to see you again. All right, let's go back to the video.
Absence of the dragons, the Crucible worshipping Hornsent and their pursuit of harnessing the powers of the Crucible rose to supremacy. Their brutal culture experimenting in enacting true horror to mimic the power of the Crucible of the dragons. As their civilization and culture thrived in the absence of the all-powerful dragons, the Hornsent viewed the presence of horns to be associated with the Crucible, the melding pots of life that fueled the power of the previous ruling race. And they were technically right. They experimented with melding life, creating crude homages to the ancient technology, attempting to ferment into existence a god or ascendant to lead them. Their discovery of the shaman.
Yeah, and I think that's just a little bit of an unfortunate understanding due to the fact that the inner jar innards and whatnot talk about saints rather than just like good people. So I don't think that people that got jarred are truly meant to ascend. Otherwise, I would have kind of imagined maybe something a bit better of the actual jar folk than how they end up.
A race of peoples whose flesh melded harmoniously with others, fueled their zealousy, and they were eventually successful in creating their first saint, the Saint of the Rot. Their civilization continued to grow. The
And I definitely dislike the way that language is used.
Association with horns became evidence of divinity with this growth, and the script went from two equal forces that mutually hated each other to those donning horns were blessed by the Crucible. When the Hornsent were betrayed, which is a topic I'll be exploring in depth in my next video, Marika flipped the script, and the Hornsent were no longer the rulers, but the ruled. Without delving too far into the topic of how it occurred, I would like to note on what happened afterward. The primordial Crucible was used as the garden bed for the Erdtree, and was the primordial form of it. The Crucible resulted in omen, horned individuals akin to the Hornsent. However, instead of reverence as they would have experienced in the Hornsent society, they were shunned and reviled, and hidden underground in sewers. While the reason for them being banished and shunned would likely appear obvious to most of you, that Marika, the new ruler of the New Age, reviled the Hornsent and what they did to her people, and saw the horns of the Omen as a sickening eyesore she wished to rid the world of, worth crusading against. However, I believe that isn't the only reason that they were locked away and hidden. Much like in our world, countries capable of producing nuclear weapons are not all that excited about sharing that technology, for obvious reasons. They don't want others to attain the same power they have, but also they don't want to create any potential threats to their supremacy. And another culture, or especially an enemy, say one already capable of repelling your forces, that learned of this technology, would be able to harness it to use against the Golden Order. And that could not happen, given it was likely by the power of a Crucible that Marika was able to turn the tables on the Hornsent to begin with. So, the Crucible Knights, or most of them, were sent away with Godfrey, jailed, scattered, the Omen were banished, oppressed, locked away, and the legend of the Crucible was so very obscured, literal Crucible Knights went on lifelong journeys in an attempt to find out what a Crucible actually is. All this was done so that no other could harness the power of a Crucible. And when and if they did, it was a disaster. Or worse still, blasphemy. That is how, in the example of at least the Horned Crucible touched, the perception went from it simply being a mutation and mutual hatred, to something divine, to something reviled and hidden. However,
So on that note, I think it's important to remember that despite Rykard, going to blasphemy and whatnot, he doesn't necessarily become as powerful as Marika or potentially even like Godfrey. Although mechanically maybe he could be Godfrey, I don't really know. But I suppose it's arguable because some of the other demigods like Millennia are another form of Crucible according to Scummage Infa's own arguments here. But then I feel like that doesn't do the best job explaining why they would fight Radahn to like a stalemate or not be able to conquer the non-Crucible touched folk, if that makes any sense. So what else is it going to say? Right. So I guess now that I'm thinking about it, it's really weird that Morgott and Mohg were said to be imprisoned underground since birth, because if they were born before the Erdtree, then Marika just freaking hated them because of like the Hornsent connection. But she seemed to still work with the Hornsent well enough up until the sealing of the, well, even after the sealing of the Shadow Realm, because of the upper portion of a near limb being missing during the time of Messmer's Crusade, which would have happened after Radagon at least met Renala and whatnot. So could that imply that Morgott and Mohg were born way later in Marika's reign than many might believe? I wondered if they were born, pretty early, but I guess there is room to think that they could have been born like at the very tail end of Godfrey's reign. Now I'm just trying to think of like Morgott being called the Grace Given and how relevant that might be as a point of comparison to the Hornsent. And Tawai says, when Morgott dies, his horns disappear. You always wondered about that. Yeah, it would have been nice if we could see what happens to Mohg when he actually dies. Obviously, he explodes in a silvery, misty powder and whatnot, but we don't really get to take a good look at his actual corpse. And then Meow Laser, welcome back in, and Enter Y, nice to see you again. And then Cohiba 888, nice to see you. Captini asks, is Rykard's blasphemy that the things he absorbs don't die but are alive with him together? I don't necessarily know. Well, you could say that because it doesn't go back to the Erdtree. I think in that regard, it would definitely be seen as a blasphemous act. But it's kind of funny because although maybe there's more context to this that I don't know, I just always thought that blaspheming was more or less like cursing the gods rather than specific acts, although obviously certain acts were blasphemous in and of themselves. So yeah, maybe it is just more that things don't go to the Erdtree. And then Pigsy points out that Devonia was looking for the origin of the Crucible and not the Crucible itself. Yeah, and that is something that I've wondered like how relevant that is to bring up to other people in trying to make some other points. It always feels like I'm doing flips for these mental gymnastics. Meow Laser can't believe I'm having issues with the timeline. It sucks to suck, doesn't it? And then Cohiba says there's Godfrey's dialogue to consider. Morgott, it's been a long while. Well, even if it was just at the end of his reign, it would still be a long while for him, wouldn't it? Stoutboat says, would Godwin have been born before any of America's enemies were defeated, seeing as the America-Radagon Union begets cursed children? I have long wondered if the reason that Godwin was more humanoid, or more pure, I guess, whatever you want to call him, is because he could have been the firstborn. And that made a lot more sense back when I thought the Crucible was a more recent development with the reign of Godfrey. But I guess I might need to rethink this now. So could Morgoth and Moog have been the oldest, and then Godwin was the third child? And then what is the difference between the three? I don't know. But very good questions.
Horns are but one aspect of the crucibles that we see, and the perception of the other crucible touched have their own individual stories. The story of the other crucible touched is the story of perception. While horns may be an affliction to some that slowly cripple the person they grow on, growing into their eyes and such, it is seen as a blessing compared to others, a sign of being chosen and channeling the divine. Other blessings or mutations may be more aesthetically cursed looking and thus perceived as such. After all, look at the fly people. Now that is clearly an illness. No room for that being anything other than a curse, no? Well, that was the opinion of the Hornsent, mutants of the Crucible, regarding the fly people. Other mutants of the Crucible. The Ale Talisman reads, a talisman depicting a...
Now, I'm wondering if he means this literally, or like, hold on, if he means like the Crucible in the sense of the Crucible Knight Crucible, or if he's aware of their potential connections to the Mother of Truth and like the blood flies and whatnot, which is one of the casualties of trying to recontextualize a term which has a kind of more specific understanding in the base game already.
Soul taken by sickness. When certain ailments are triggered, this talisman grants resistance to the same ailment. When the weak were infected with the dreaded fly sickness, they perished well before the metamorphosis could take hold. Oddly, those who cared for the infected and made certain they were given a proper burial were never afflicted themselves. So this crucible mutation was labelled a disease, and not one that could be passed on. A disease that just so happened to have individuals display aspects of flies, which don aspects of the crucible. As I stated earlier, the crucible of the potentate jars...
And some of you might be wondering, like, these aren't feathers. Believe it or not, sometimes feather and wing aren't that easily discernible in Japanese, and sometimes you take a gamble. So yeah, I think this is kind of like a feather, but kind of not. So it's probably more akin to like the Crucible Wing Talisman. Actually, I should just double check. Maybe they did differentiate it. If only I could spell, that might help. Yeah, I guess it is kind of like feather in this context. Well, yeah, it's not too important.
Results in the fly people, since their method is more akin to rot by fermenting and pickling their injured, poisoned, rotting victims. Their affliction is more akin to the bug-like rot crucible touched, the kindred of rot. While this is an interesting example of intermutant prejudice, there are wildly varying perceptions of the crucible touch depending on the crucible in question. The horned were revered and then hated. The reptiles of Volcano Manor were simply seen as denizens. The fly people are sickly and weak, but worthy of proper burial. The kindred of rot are pests unworthy of consideration. The death-touched are blighted. The scaled are devolving. The death birds are revered and feared, and so on, and so on. Whoever writes the history books, basically. And there you have it, the Crucibles and the Crucible Touched. Thank you for watching, and let me know what you think of the Crucibles in the comments, and tell me, did I miss any? I'm more than certain I have, but maybe first check my previous video on Crucibles, where I talk about even more potential Crucibles, including the Giant's Furnace. Thank you for subscribing and sharing this around. I'll see you in the next video. I think I have some pretty juicy takes for you all. In the meantime, here are 2 other videos I've made, both
Okay, so we're going to pause it there, and we're going to go ahead and link Scum Mage Infa's video into the chat if you guys want to give them a like, a sub, or support that way. So, before getting into some of my thoughts, because I've already forgotten them, Teen Sith said, the way that the Omen are chucked in the sewers is more of an Elden Lord Radagon move, but the shackles have the ancient Erdtree symbol on them. Annoying. So not only that, the shackles say that from birth they were imprisoned underground, which, if you want to tie that to the Radagon stuff, by all means have at it. I mean, Radagon is America, right? So maybe there is some truth to that. It just really sucks that we are only kind of ever told of Radagon being active at one point in history, and it kind of only being vaguely hinted that he could have been active in other points of history. So a lot of that also relies on one's individual interpretation of the three-body problem in a different sense than the normal term, whether or not America and Radagon were one body, or America and Radagon were 2 bodies, which 1 + 2 = 3. So anyway, moving on from that, the realists wanted to check if the jar scent and their homing meat projectiles is similar to the Lamenter's darkness projectiles. I don't think I've used the innered meat to actually know what it looks like now that you mention it. I might need to remember to do that. Just like the way I needed to remember to check out that Scourge Beast buff, but yeah. Oh yeah, and so you guys were asking about the order of the royal family's lineage. We're not told directly. However, Godric's Great Rune does state that Godfrey and the Golden Lineage were the first demigods. And we're also told that Mesmer is older than Radahn. So Mesmer, if he is a technical demigod, should therefore come after the Golden Lineage, but before Rykard and Ranni, because Ranni is younger than... sorry. He should be older than Radahn and Ranni, because Ranni is younger than her brothers. Mesmer Knights have the ancient Erdtree symbol on their armor and use Radagon's weapon art. So I don't know if we could say it's the ancient Erdtree symbol on it. If you're talking about the hammer, it's just got the 3 rings, which is kind of analogous to what you see with the Radagon hammer. Not Radagon hammer, but the Golden Order Fundamentalist sigil. But, right. Kyle said he was active with Mikola, but yeah, it's odd how little he is mentioned. It's mentioned America disappears after the shattering, but did people just forget Radagon existed? Apparently. I mean, people just thought he was a champion. They're like, he probably shouldn't have been an Elden Lord to begin with, right? So it is really annoying just how little info we get from them, especially since we can interact with one of the demigods directly, aka Ranni, and we don't have the presence of mind or the natural inquisitive to be like, what's all this then? You know? Oh yeah, right. So going back to the whole aspect of the Crucible Touched and their Crucibles, I think he did a good job toward the beginning of the video with saying that it's kind of all tied to the power of life and the kind of aspects of radiation relating to that. However, I do think he may have missed some other connections in that having an excessive amount of life put into something is effectively a curse, and this might be a little bit unfair with only having Elden Ring as the context to make that clear, but I think even on Elden Ring's terms alone, it can make sense. But in any way, like in Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, I think it's Dark Souls 1, it has a description for power within, which says that excess power eats away at the user's life force, and that is shared in common with things like Chaos Blades, which are described as cursed. So curse equals excess life / excess power equals eating away at things, and that ties into a lot of the linguistics pertaining to curses and the term that I've talked about before multiple times throughout my channel, Mushibamu, the way that curses eat away through things. And of course, Mushibamu uses the same kanji for the eclipse, like Shoku. So the curse might have been tied to the eclipse at one point, but, well, you can ignore that last statement. Maybe some curses were tied with the eclipse at some point, but it could have also been tied with Godwin in some way. Deathblight is a curse, kind of, but anyway. The reason why I think that's pertinent to the Crucible is that when things are touched by the Crucible, whether it be the Omen or the Horn Scent, they have tainted, cursed blood, and they have also allegedly been touched by the Crucible in the past. So it's a lot of seemingly parallel tracks that actually end up being perpendicular to each other and crossing over. So it's a little bit sad he didn't get to that point directly, although maybe that would contradict some of his thoughts about Rot acting as a Crucible or some other things on that front. So as Teen Sith was saying way earlier, I don't necessarily think the points are improved by like separating the idea of the primordial Crucible from just the idea of a Crucible in general, and I think it might end up creating more confusion than cohesion with the plot. And I think this is just more of like an issue of the terminology rather than the actual idea itself. So, right. Little Church Lore said, maybe Radagon was anti-giant because they're Crucible / Chaos related and he embodies order. Well, you might be right about that, but then, like, it's a little bit odd that we have that gap in the timeline between the Fire Giants and then Godfrey's rule and then Radagon's rise. But there is certainly a number of things to consider with how the minor Erdtree is said to, like, lack order, the incantation, and the way that the Shadow Tree is born of dark emotions and is without order itself. Kyle said, you don't think the Horn Scent ever ruled? Do you think the Giants ruled them? America overthrew the Giants, and that's how she got the Horn Scent respect for a while. And so then that ties into, when do you think the Horn Scent Gate of Divinity in the story trailer happened? Or like, when did that event happen? So yeah, I would also put the Age of Plenty pre-Crusade because of the Carians and whatnot. We did get some Age of Plenty info in the DLC, just not the info you'd hoped for. That Godfrey didn't make a face when he drank the sap. That's pretty much it. And I think like a lot of the other stuff are just like more thematic connections than definite ones. Oh, also the what are they called? The duels continued in the land of Skidoo. It's either when she became a god or sealed death, not enough info to tell. So the issue with saying it's when she became a god is that she should have become a god under like Godfrey's tenure as Elden Lord, which means like immediately after the Fire Giant War, apparently, because she told Godfrey to brandish the Elden Rings, so they had it. So why wouldn't she be a god at that point? And Beyond that, we also have the issue of America's relation to the demigods to consider, in that I think the only way the demigods could be considered demigods is due to their blood and legal relationship to America as the vision of the Elden Ring, or like the vessel of the vision of the Elden Ring and whatnot. But, okay, so I'm at a little bit of an impasse here. I don't particularly like and I don't dislike this video, so I think I'm just going to leave it as it is. But there was something I wanted. Oh yeah, the Saint Ramana stuff. Hey man, nice video, even though I didn't like it. There's one thing I wanted to touch on, though. Unfortunately, although the jar innards and whatnot talk about the shamans becoming saints, the term used in Japanese is more analogous to the horn scent telling the jar scent to be good girls / boys. Ramana uses a different term for saint and probably shouldn't be conflated with the fake saints of the jars. Don't know if that will change your opinion any, but I thought it was worth sharing. Good enough. I should have said like I reacted to this on stream, but whoops, I forgot. Cohiba said, Godfrey getting the sap, wouldn't this make it more sense at the time the Erdtree was finally created? You mean, was after? So that's why I do think that the Shadow Realm, or not like this reason specifically, but it's one of many reasons why I think the Shadow Realm was separated after the Age of Plenty had begun and was probably on its way out. So, okay. Let's go ahead and move into the next video of the night with Boris Dragosani's Elden Ring story is Norse mythology. And this was done before the DLC, so there might be some discrepancies that couldn't be accounted for.
I have a...
Alright. So let's put this over here.
question for you. What do Thor, Odin, Loki, Freya, Surtur, Hel, and Nidhogg all have in common? If you said that they are all Norse gods, you are wrong. They're all characters
Well, I think they're not entirely wrong.
in Elden Ring. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, ladies and gentlemen of the Elden Ring community. My name is Gabriel, and through reading item descriptions, analyzing appearances, and making illogical jumps to conclusion, I now believe that Elden Ring's story is Norse mythology. Before I begin, I want to let you know that there will be no spoilers for the DLC in this video. I will only be referring to the 2 DLC trailers. However, I will be making some predictions that may spoil things accidentally. I want to give a huge shout out to Game Plus Alchemist, who first made a video on this topic. I am picking up the torch where he left off, and I didn't even know it. Additionally, I will be discussing Norse mythology through the eyes of the Norse, Germanic, and pagan text, so this theory will be extremely convoluted, and nothing I say is concrete. And with that out...
Interesting. Let me listen to that. Norse, Germanic, and pagan text. So there are that many texts. I mean, I know there's like a ton of stuff. That's kind of one of the painful points of trying to look into Norse mythology for one's own.
So this theory will be extremely convoluted, and nothing I say is concrete. And with that out the way, Let's start with Thor. Thor is the son of the Jotnar goddess Jord and the Aesir god Odin. Jotnar are a type of god called giants, and they can be anything from normal people to giants to gods and even creatures. The Aesir are just traditional gods. Thor has red hair from his mother's side. He wields the one-handed hammer Mjolnir. He is the god of thunder, and he wields lightning. But what makes Thor special is the fact that he hates giants. Despite the fact that he is part giant, he is constantly killing giants at Odin's command. When Ragnarok comes, Thor leads the fight against the invading Jotnar giants, killing most of the giants before he too is killed by the giant Jormungandr. This is very similar to Radagon. Radagon in Elden Ring is tied to an item called the Giant's Red Braid, which states that, and I quote, "Every giant is red of hair, and Radagon was said to have despised his own red locks. Perhaps that was the curse of their kind." This implies that Radagon is a descendant of the fire giants.
And this kind of goes back into that issue of the localization where the Japanese just says perhaps it was the giant's curse. So it's maybe that's a little bit vague the way that I said it too. But anyway, it could be the giants cursing Radagon/America rather than being a curse that plagues the giants themselves. So basically, America is eradicating them, and perhaps the giants are like, oh, you want to get rid of us? Well, bam, now you're one of us. And so, anyway.
And that he hated his giant's heritage, seeing it as a curse. He wields the one-handed hammer, America's hammer. He throws holy magic, which looks like lightning bolts. And although it is not directly stated in the game, through an observation that Tarnished Archaeologist made in his 15th episode, we can assume that Radagon was involved in the Giant War. Tarnished Archaeologist observed that Radagon statues have trellises and vines on them. These vines look very, very similar to the trees that we see in the mountaintops of the giants, and trellises are used to grow vines. And all of the bodies in the mountaintops of the giants have vines and thorn structures on them. If we assume that Radagon is associated with vines, or controls vines, then we can also assume that Radagon killed a majority of the fire giants, as almost every body in the mountaintops of the giants has vines on them.
So there's a couple points about this which I dislike. Although I like the idea in general, the things that I dislike about it are more part of the game's fault than like the idea, if that makes sense. So what I mean by that is the vine thing is a cool idea, but it just sucks that if this was indeed the work of Radagon, that he doesn't use anything like that in his fights. Although, to be fair, the branches blocking our way into the Erdtree are supposed to be like under Radagon's control, so there is still some continuity between impenetrable thorns and Radagon. But then that also brings up the question of whether or not these are impenetrable thorns which killed the fire giants. And if they are impenetrable thorns, obviously now with the context of the DLC, we can ask ourselves if their routing was related to the Scooby-Doo tree, which is questionable and also raises just as many questions as it answers. That's a lie. It actually raises a lot more questions than it answers when you really think about it. So, moving on from that, while calling this a trellis does have a certain amount of sense to it, there's also the possibility that because this is reminiscent of Radagon's rune, this might not fully embody a trellis as one might expect. Many people have theorized that this could also embody something more akin to like the Web of Weird, which would also play into Radagon shackling the fate of the Carians and their astrology to that of the Golden Order, depending on how one feels about the telescope description. But nonetheless, there is still the metaphor of shackling the fate of the Carians through marriage. So for anybody who might not know about the Web of Weird, we're going to go ahead and I guess Wikipedia doesn't have an article on that. Okay, nope. Hellboy Web of Weird. All right. So anyway, I think this site, mimisbrunner.info, is a really good one. And I've looked at it before because, I mean, it's the first thing that comes up for the Web of Weird. But let me see chat because it looks like you guys are talking a bit. Little church lords of the belief that the giants sacrificed themselves and offered their life to the fell god. That would be really cool too. You glad I'm calling it the Scooby-Doo tree? Well, the fact that they had the gall to call it the Skadu tree, knowing that people aren't actually going to pronounce it like Shadu, or Shadow even, they get it. They deserve it. I don't know. Cohiba doesn't buy Radagon single-handedly felling that many giants. This seems like the work of an army, and trolls were definitely involved. That's true. We are told that the trolls betrayed, and we're also told, like, Godfrey should brandish the Elden Ring, so to say that they were all killed by Radagon presents some issues, but counterpoint, no matter who actually killed them, the fact that so many corpses are found with this design presents issues in and of itself, doesn't it? So, if not Radagon, I've wondered if Marika could have done it, and maybe the reason why it's not used in the fight with Radagon is because he doesn't have full access to her personality slash skill set, but that's a big old question mark, isn't it? And Shupa, nice to see you. Post DLC, the giants being impaled could be the work of Mesmer, or at least maybe it could be. I would like that more if the stakes were more uniform and like just vertical rather than branching from this kind of weird plant. But yes, Mesmer is indeed called the Impaler for a reason. Captini always felt that there's something missing with the thorns. There are those thorns in the Stormvale and the mountain. You always expected to come from the same source. So this is some truly tinfoil hat wearing theory crafting going on. So if you're playing Elden Ring, go ahead and pop on the Nox Mirror Helm or EG's Mirror Helm and enjoy this one, in that I've wondered whether or not Godwin had a hand in the routing of the ancient giants, and whether or not this could have been tied to his power, and whether or not this was like the form of Deathroot before it became influenced by the power of death and the Rune of Death. But like I said, some big Nox Mirror Helm energy right there. Okay, so what was I saying right before this and I got distracted? Oh, right, the Web of Word. Weird word, I don't know. Bird, it's the word. Oh yeah, I should probably make this gigantic. All right, description. The Web of Word symbol occurs in two primary forms. The first form, A, consists of a thread or twig-like structure, and the second, B, consists of a geometric representation of A. Both forms consist of three sets of 3 lines, emphasizing the number 9. 3 and 9 are central numbers in historic Germanic paganism. Both symbols can be found on various commercial websites described as the Web of Word, or similarly but less commonly Skoldsnet. And then, hold on. It's unclear where the symbol originates from. Okay. The underlying concept of reality is the web which holds everything together in all dimensions, including time. It is in essence very simple and can be depicted as 9 lines locked together in such a way as to form the building blocks of the universe. And so that might tie into, if not the Golden Order, at the very least Golden Order fundamentalism, like kind of locking things into place perhaps. But anyway, the first tool is the runes, which are extracted from the web and reveal 16 different aspects of reality, not by having fixed meanings, but by their associations. By learning and performing the stances, the runes become part of the self, and we begin to integrate ourselves into the web of reality. So in some ways, one could compare that to like the law of causality, because if you know what one thing is in relation to another thing, then you can kind of understand that association. And then if you understand the nature of that association, the causality between these two things, then you could apply that principle of causality, the law of causality, even further to understand the relationship between multiple things and potentially even all things. So that's a pretty big power move as far as like what the symbol could represent. So that's pretty much what I want to talk about with that for now. That I don't necessarily know if it's fair to say that it's just a trellis, even if it is reminiscent of a trellis. Okay. So that's good enough for now. Too esoteric for you? All right. And yeah, Kyle says weird means like fate. So many people think of the web of weird as the web of fate, which ties very strongly into Radagon and things like destined death or the fate in the night skies. You feel like you're listening to Terrence Howard? Don't you know that the square root of 1 is 2? Or the other way around? The square root of 2 is 1? I don't remember what he thought. 1 times 1 equals 2. It's so silly to misunderstand that. And Little Church Lore said, in your opinion, the trellis hypothesis does not meet the rule of cool standard. He's a gardener, y'all. He's a gardener for the Erdtree.
As almost every body in the mountaintops of the giants has vines on them. So both of the gods are the descendants of giants. They both have red hair. They both hate the giants and their giants' heritage. They both wield a one-handed hammer. They both throw lightning bolts. They're both named champion. Thor is the champion of the Aesir, and Muriel calls Radagon Great Champion Radagon, and they both fought a war against the giants and killed many giants. The similarities are striking, but let's discuss the trickster god Loki. Loki is the descendant of the giant Farbati and his mother, the giant Laufey. Although he is a giant by heritage, he is considered an Aesir god, as he helps the Aesir gods quite frequently. Except when he doesn't. He has red hair and he is a shapeshifter. He uses his abilities to take on new identities. Famously, he turns into a fish to avoid Aesir prosecution, a horse to get pregnant, and a female giant to stop his brother from being revived. He constantly lies and plays tricks on the gods, and is infamous for questioning the Aesir and their authority on a semi-regular basis. He calls the gods adulterous and fickle, which is probably a lie, but in any case, Loki grows to hate the Aesir. Loki kills his brother in a ploy against the Aesir gods, and this results in him getting captured and tortured during Ragnarok. At the end of Ragnarok, Loki escapes and sides with the giants during the Aesir versus Giant War. Sadly, he dies, fighting the Aesir god Heimdall. He is sometimes referred to as the household spirit by Germanic and pagan people, who believe that his spirit lives on and is mischievous, causing chaos in the house. But Loki...
So, who do y'all think that he's going to map onto Loki? Just kind of curious, because in some ways I could almost see it being Ronnie, but I feel like I really don't think like a ton work with this paradigm, but I don't know. Bach, okay. America, Ronnie, Bach, Ronnie, America, Patches. Patches is probably the best answer. Moog, Godfrey, Ronnie, or Patches. Okay. All right, well, let's find out.
He is not a good nor evil god. He's simply a chaotic, mischievous god who is completely apathetic to the Aesir. Lunar Princess Rani is the descendant of Queen Renala and Radagon. Renala is a Carian queen, which makes Rani a Carian princess, and Radagon is the descendant of giants, which makes Rani part giant. Rani had red hair, but now she's something different. Rani had a black knife assassin carve the rune of death into her body, which left her burned and bodiless. So now Rani lives as a spirit in a doll's body. This act allowed Rani to abandon her body and change her fate, which allowed her to rebel against the Golden Order. We first meet Rani in the Church of Ella, surrounded by mist. She lies and claims that she is the witch Renna. She asks if you are the Tarnished who rides a spectral steed called Torrent. If you lie to her and say that you don't ride Torrent, she compliments your willingness and ability to lie and thinks that lying will keep you safe. If you tell her that you do ride Torrent, she begins to question when the Tarnished will, and I quote, no longer be subservient to the two fingers. In either case, she gives you the spirit calling bell and disappears, taking her fog and mist with her. The Sword of Night and Flame states that the astrologers, who preceded sorcerers, established themselves in the mountaintops, and they consider the fire giants their neighbors.
Wait, Rani also gifts Torrent? That's not true. That's Melina, isn't it? Because you need to be able to ride Torrent for Rani to appear. Cohiba doesn't like that this theory shatters like glass if Radagon isn't part giant. That's, yeah. I was gonna leave it be and just like go along with the stuff for the fun of it, just because as much crap as I tend to give alchemy, it's only fair that I give some crap to the Norse stuff. Although maybe this isn't the best example of it, just because of like the Radagon stuff, and this was also made before the DLC released. But despite all that, I do think there are still a lot of inspirations from Norse mythology in Elden Ring, which might be worth food for thought, even if we don't think that the way this particular theorist is putting the pieces together is fully tenable. But I agree, though. Teensis said, the problem of trying to map to reference material, right? That's why I try to avoid the one-to-one stuff and try to stay close to thematics or things which I think are like more mechanically relevant, which typically tends to be like the Shinto stuff or previous FromSoft titles. You don't know why you thought it was from Rani?
Is another carrion-based weapon, which states that, and I quote, a moon greatsword is bestowed by a carrion queen upon her spouse to honor long-standing tradition. This description implies that swords were used to represent marital alliances in carrion history. The word knight in Sword Knight of Flame may be a reference to the moon. This could explain why the Sword of Night and Flame is hidden in the carrion manor, as it represents an ancient alliance between the carrions and the giants.
How do you guys feel about the idea of Mesmer mapping onto Loki now? Obviously, we don't necessarily have as much of the fratricide aspect to look at, depending on how one feels about Melina's relationship to him and whether or not he burned Melina. But he certainly burned the Horn Scent and kind of instituted a Ragnarok of his own. But yeah, I just don't think mapping things one-to-one is like the best way to go. Mesmer isn't Trixie, he's Depression-y. He's Trixie to the Horn Scent. You're not familiar enough with Norse myth to know. Fair enough. Fair enough.
And would have held great importance to them. So both of these gods are related to giants. They both have red hair. They lie and use secret identities. They both rebelled against the godly order in their lands. They're totally apathetic to the death of the gods, but they are also friendly with the giants. Loki is referred to as the household spirit, and Rani just is a spirit in a doll's body. And both gods are neither good nor evil. They're simply doing what they think is right. But there's one other connection between the two. Ragnarok. Ragnarok is the prophecy of the god's apocalypse in Norse mythology. The prophecy goes something like this. Balder, an immortal god, is slain, and this causes a long, dangerous winter called Fimbulwinter to begin. The moon wolf catches the sun during the summer equinox, which causes an eclipse, and all the stars disappear from the night sky. The giants invade Asgard with Loki, so the Aesir and Vanir gods team up and fight the giants to try and save Asgard. But they fail and die in the process.
So this is kind of why I'm glad I decided to look at this stuff despite, not buying it fully 1-to-1, because I definitely forgot about the idea that the eclipse causes the stars in the sky to disappear, and that might be really relevant to Elden Ring because of the way that fate is said to be cradled within the stars of the night sky, and with fate being tied to things like destined death, that might be relevant to the whole Godwin stuff, or even like the prior Mikola plans and whatnot.
Surtur, the Jotnar god of fire, in his dying breath, plunges his great sword into the heart of Asgard and lights it ablaze, destroying the realm completely. This single act shakes all the realms on Yggdrasil's branches and lights the outside of the world tree on fire. In the end, Yggdrasil ceases burning, the sun re-enters the sky, and Baldur is reborn into the world as the last living god in a realm now ruled by men. So how does this connect to Rani? Through Loki. The Aesir god that Loki killed before was Baldur. Baldur was unkillable because his mother Frigg made everything in the Nine Realms promise to not hurt Baldur. Everything except mistletoe, because it was too young to make a promise. Loki learns of this weakness, crafts a mistletoe spear, and convinces Hodor, a blind god, to plunge the spear into Baldur, which kills him instantly, setting Ragnarok into motion. This single act also turns mistletoe into the symbolic representation of death for the pagans. In Elden Ring, Rani steals the rune of death from Malekith and imbues the Black Knife Assassin's daggers with destined death. This sets in motion her scheme, known as the Night of the Black Knives. She convinces the Black Knife Assassins to kill Godwyn and go on a, and I quote, god hunt in the lands between, killing many demigods.
Wait, what is this quote from?
Known as the Night of the Black Knives. She convinces the Black Knife Assassins to kill Godwyn and go on a, and I quote, god hunt in the lands between, killing...
I wonder if this is like one of the pre-release materials on the intranet, but it just sucks because a lot of that god hunt terminology is more related to the godskins, and that could have been retconned for all we know. Or I guess you can't call it a retcon if it never released, huh? So anyway, y'all are talking about Arthurian myth and Egyptian myth and whether or not that relates into Elden Ring. Maybe I should look for videos on that. I think the Arthurian stuff we could probably find like maybe 1 or 2. I don't know how good they'd be, but I'm a little bit more doubtful about the Egyptian stuff, but I would definitely be interested in that as well. There's a big, what's the word? Not like pet project, hobby, pet subject of mine back when I was in the elementary school. That and volcanoes, tornadoes, etc.
Many demigods. The death of Godwyn pushes Queen Marika to shatter the Elden Ring, and this period is known as the Shattering. Pieces of the shattered Elden Ring in the form of great runes, shards, and rune arcs are scattered throughout the lands between. The demigod children begin collecting these fragments, and soon start fighting over them in a war known as the Shattering War. When the Shattering War is over, no lands are claimed, no demigods are felled. However, grace is given back to a select few tarnished, which causes them to rise from their graves and seek the Elden Ring for themselves. This is exactly what the player does. We wake up with our regained grace, and we kill the demigod children and claim their great runes. The tarnished, or Melna, burns the Erdtree, and we have a final face-off with Radagon and the Elden Beast.
So this is where I do think that they're going way too off the rails here, because a moment ago, and maybe I'm just missing something because I'm a little bit distracted with the streaming and whatnot, but the whole death and resurrection of Baldur was kind of mapped onto Godwyn a moment ago, but now the resurrection aspect is being mapped onto the Tarnished. So it just feels really sloppy, unless I'm missing something, that they're just kind of moving the goalposts around so much to fit a certain worldview.
Successfully usurping Queen Marika's order and starting a new age of the player's choice. Let's compare. Ragnarok and the Shattering are both started by gods who have giants' heritage, Both acts were committed as a form of rebellion against the ruling gods. They both created special weapons to kill gods. Loki created the mistletoe spear, and Ronnie created the Black Knife Assassin's daggers. They both had
Okay, I'm following. So, started by giants' descendants, I was thinking of like the war against the giants, like that being the beginning, but I see where it's coming from now. It's fine.
had a third party, Hodor and the Black Knife Assassins, kill the god. Balder was Odin's favorite child, and Godwyn was Queen Marika's favorite child. Both resulted in a god war, like the Shattering and the Aesir versus Giant War. Yggdrasil and the Erdtree are both lit on fire. Ragnarok ends in the death of all gods, men reclaiming the world, and the resurrection of a long-dead god. Elden Ring ends with the death of all the demigods, the Tarnished reclaiming the world, and an undead Tarnished rising to godhood. They are incredibly similar. However, they differ in one small and explainable way. In Norse mythology, Loki is captured after killing Balder by the Aesir gods. He is imprisoned and tortured with snake venom for most of Ragnarok, and then frees himself, only to be killed by Heimdall. In Elden Ring, Ranni escapes any repercussions from Queen Marika and the Two Fingers by slaying her body. In doing so, she not only abandons her fate with the Golden Order, but she also abandons any fate that she would share with her Norse counterpart. Sacrificing a part of your body to change your fate is a shared theme in Norse mythology and in Elden Ring, but Ranni is not the best example of this. The best example of this is Odin. And before I continue, I need to mention something.
All right, so before the warning gets concluded, yeah, going back to some of the points here, I don't know if part of it is just the presentation or whether it's the idea in general that I'm finding problematic. And what I mean by that is obviously these points are cherry picked to like fit a conclusion, and I think that's what irks me and is kind of like hard to really put my finger on specifically. And then Bigsy says, Elden Ring isn't about Norse stuff or alchemy or anything else. It references those things and takes inspiration to make its own story. Right. And so even if it isn't about Norse mythology specifically, I think part of the YouTube thing is this guy's just trying to make a clickbaity title to get people interested in learning more about a subject that they're passionate about, which is perfectly fine. Just, part of the game. And then the other thing is, even if we disagree with a lot of it, there can still be kernels of truth or sources of inspiration that we could see in what they offer that might have value despite everything else, which is why I'll continue on with the video. But Corn, nice to see you again. We actually had a question for you last night on stream. What was it pertaining to saints and... Saints and something. So, Corn, what is Saints and something? No, I'll have to think of it, or Little Church Lore will have to remember. And Little Church Lore said about this video, it's similar to reading your horoscope. Yeah, that's kind of how I view a lot of these kind of sweeping thematic connections, whether it be alchemy, Norse mythology, Egyptian mythology, Arthurian stuff, etc. Oh, yeah, and Lord of the Rings, too, yeah. Is the term virgin analogous to the term saint? Okay. Wait, the way that you say it like that makes it sound a bit different than the way we were talking about it last night. Because thinking about it this way, when you say it like that, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, if a saint was part of the church and it's the, saintly thing to be chaste, then I could see why it could be analogous to virgin, but anyway, not to Corn's knowledge. Okay, that's what I was figuring. Are we Frodo? No, we're Sam. All right.
Is Odin. And before I continue, I need to mention something. These next comparisons are way more speculative and confusing. So pay close attention, ask questions in the comment section, and if you start to think I'm crazy, welcome to the party.
And then Corn says you don't have to be virginal to be a saint. Yeah, that's kind of what I figured, especially if they had a life before joining the clergy. Although you might have more info like even afterward. But yeah. Saint Peter was a married man and had kids. Fair enough. I forgot about like the super early days. Yeah. That's not what Little Church Lore is saying? Okay.
Now, let us...
All right, realist, I'm going to be real with you. I read that as you went to eat turtle poop.
Let's discuss Odin. Odin is the king of the Aesir gods and is known as the Allfather for ruling all of the 9 realms. He has blonde hair, is missing an eye, and is often portrayed wearing a cloak and a hat to hide his appearance. He is a shapeshifter and is portrayed as a smart, cunning, and manipulative leader, but he wanted more. So Odin went to the foot of Yggdrasil and visited the giant Mimir at his well. Mimir's well is fed by the fallen dew from Yggdrasil's leaves, and this water feeds Yggdrasil's roots in an endless cycle which imbues the water with Seidr magic to see the future. Odin asked Mimir to drink from his well, and Mimir agreed on the condition that Odin made a blood sacrifice and removed his eye first. Odin agreed and promptly removed his left eye and offered it to Mimir. Mimir tossed his eye into the well of wisdom, where it fell to Yggdrasil.
Sucks that this is his right eye right here. Maybe the image is mirrored?
Yggdrasil's roots. Odin drank from the well, which granted him the wisdom of the ages, and through his severed eye, Odin had visions. He saw glimpses of runes that he could not explain, and moments of Ragnarok. However, Odin could not clearly see these visions, so he made another sacrifice. Odin impaled himself with his spear Gundir, or a piece of Yggdrasil, and hung himself from Yggdrasil's branches. And for 9 days and nights, with no food nor mead, Odin swayed from Yggdrasil, slowly bleeding into its roots. During this time, the Germanic and pagan people believed that Odin was in a state between life and death. His mind was freed from his body. So for 9 days, Odin's body traveled...
And I'm glad he brought this point up, because I was definitely going to do it if he did not. And he might go into the etymology about what Yggdrasil could mean, whether or not it means like a tree, like the hanging tree, a gallows tree, or whatever you want to call it, or potentially even the steed of Odin is another way it could be localized from what I've heard or read.
To the realm of Hell in Niflheim, and he slowly learned to translate a rune each day from the dead. On the 9th night, while translating the final rune, something happened. For a brief moment, light disappeared in the 9 realms. The sun was gone. The living realm of Midgard and the dead realm of Niflheim collapsed on one another. During this brief time, sorcery, spirits, and necromancy entered Midgard. They became incredibly powerful. Midgard was overrun by these forces of sorcery, necromancy, and spirits until Odin woke up, screaming, at the end of the 9th night, and the 2 realms separated once again. During this process, Odin became incredibly powerful as he became part of Yggdrasil. Additionally, he had translated all the runes and also saw Ragnarok. He saw Loki's betrayal, Baldur's death, Thor's death by the Midgard serpent, his own death by Fenrir, and the destruction of Asgard by the giant Surtur. Unsure if he could be fate.
And for anybody who might be thinking these terms are familiar, yeah, Final Fantasy VII ripped off a lot of the names of things related to Norse mythology, but not exactly the mythology itself. So Midgar comes from Midgard, go figure. Niflheim became Nibelheim or Nibelheim, whichever. And the Midgar Zolom was the Midgar Zormer, which is just a funny localization. So I digress.
Odin tried anyway. He chained down and blinded the wolf Fenrir. He had the Midgard serpent cast into the seas. He ordered Thor to kill all the giants in Midgard, which all eventually led to the giants invading Asgard during Ragnarok, and the death of the Aesir. Queen Marika, the Eternal, is the god queen of the lands between. She has blonde hair, wears a cloak, and in Rani's ending, we can see her fractured head, and see that she is missing both eyes. There are 2 talismans in Elden Ring. One's called Marika's Scar Seal, and one is called Marika's Sword Seal. Marika's Scar Seal is found at the base of a waterfall, in Siofra, which you access by going down the Siofra River well. Both items are described as eyeballs, with runes inscribed on them. Now, we don't know much about Marika's personality. It's quite ambiguous. We can assume, though, that she is well-spoken and ruthless leader, and we can assume this from Melena's history lessons that she gives us in church. However, if you want to understand Marika more, you need to analyze her past actions. When the Gloam-Eyed Queen harnesses a piece of the Rune of Death and imbues her flame with it, creating the Black Flame, which is at risk of killing the gods, Marika orders Malekith to defeat her in battle, take the Rune of Death, so that the Gloam-Eyed Queen and her godskins no longer pose any threat. When Marika decides to create her own order, she creates the Golden Order, which she creates by removing the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring. When a part of the Rune of Death is stolen by Princess Rani, and she arms the Black Knife assassins with death-infused blades, Marika has Malekith retrieve the fragment and imbue his body with the Rune of Death, so it can never be stolen again. So Queen Marika is very concerned about the Rune of Death. But why is she so concerned about the Rune of Death? In an early interview with our Lord and Savior Miyazaki, Miyazaki stated that, and I quote, "The demigods' immortality stems from having their fated deaths removed from the Elden Ring. Removing death changed the fates of the demigods. So Queen Marika is obsessed with fate. But how does Marika know her fate? And how does she know that she needs to change her fate? Unless she's already seen fate. Which means that Queen Marika can see fate. Look at this. When we find Queen Marika in-game, she is inside the...
That when, though. All right, so, I almost called Little Church Lore Stella. So, Little Church Lore and Korn have just kind of like figured it out, and Little Church Lore was saying that the title Virgin was sometimes given to saints, particularly women who were martyred in the early centuries of Christianity. That was her understanding. And then Korn said, no, they understand what they're asking. And yes, absolutely, that was the case with several saints, especially women. MK says, Melina is Gek confirmed. Thanks, Random Mythology. Yep. And then Teen Sith can't say you ever thought that. You know, the way he's visually mapped this out is making you feel a little less bad about how you map things out for yourself. I don't know if that's an insult or praise, but I feel like it's probably the former. And then Zafe the Scholar, welcome on in. How's it going? Yeah, we caught your Godwin video the other night. That was pretty good too. So what else was I going to say? Stout said, after seeing Mesmer in his eye, do we still think the Sword Seals and Scar Seals are Radagon and Marika's actual eyes? I never thought they were their actual eyes, and I'm not just saying that to be like, oh, I'm an edgy hipster. No, I just thought that they were cursing other people's eyes with their seals and whatnot. So appreciate me, thank you. Yeah, watching all of these videos inspires me to make more videos of my own, which means I'm not doing that currently. Nah, I do need to make like a bunch of shorts or shorter videos talking about like the translation stuff. I just haven't gotten around to it. So every day I come on stream, I suffer because I'm like, I should make more content. And I mean, of course, this is kind of content in a way, but it's a bit of a different vibe, you know. And then Scummage Info, welcome on into stream. We managed to watch your video. Man, why am I so bad at remembering things on stream? On the Crucible Touch and the Crucibles. Oh, so you probably saw my comment, which might have summoned you. Right. So I do have mixed feelings about your video, just to be clear here. I'm not just going to put up a front, but right. I liked a lot of the comparisons that you brought up with the Crucibles and life and radiation. It's very similar to some of my thoughts about the topic for a long time. And another thing that I wanted to mention in relation to that, and I don't know if you've played Dark Souls or Bloodborne, but typically in these games, it seems when something is imbued with a form of life that's external to themselves, they kind of become cursed by that life form and it kind of eats away at them. And that might also tie into things pertaining to the Crucible and its form of life radiation, if we want to call it that. What do I think about mistranslation and localization? That's actually the biggest focus of my channel for the most part, where I tend to look at the English and Japanese text of Elden Ring and try to give people some extra context for things based off of what we might think because of the localization versus how well that maps onto the Japanese. So when we look at like the Ramana stuff, Remembrance of the Saint of the Bud. So we have Seijo, which means like holy woman, aka saint for her, whereas the saints of the jars and whatnot are just like Yokibito. I don't remember. And so that just means like a good person, which doesn't quite have that same kind of religious connotation as it does in English, unfortunately. Yeah, it lost the annals of history from Dark Souls 1. You haven't played Bloodborne yet? Great shape. Don't worry about it. It's a good one. Bloodborne in some ways is a little bit less relevant on that aspect of things about like sainthood. Well, maybe not sainthood, but anyway, at least for this topic specifically, in curses. But there's some other things that are very, very Bloodborne in Elden Ring. Okay. Now, having said that, did I finish my point about the video here? Maybe. Oh, no, I think I got distracted by the actual chat. All right, so I'm going to back it up briefly and then resume.
So Queen Marika is obsessed with fate. But how does Marika know her fate? And how does she know that she needs to change her fate? Unless she's already seen fate. Which means that Queen Marika can see fate. Look at this. When we find Queen Marika in-game, she is inside the Erdtree, hanging from a rune arc, with a red spear sticking out of her side. She looks hollow, lifeless, maybe even soulless. And we see her body fall limp to the ground. The only time that we've seen Queen Marika's body move is when Radagon begins to take control of her body and grabs Marika's hammer so he can try and fight off the Tarnished who just entered. It's very odd. We don't see Queen Marika herself move, only Radagon taking control of the body. So yes, I think Queen Marika is Odin. Queen Marika and Odin are both blonde gods depicted with cloaks. They are both missing an eyeball, which can be found at the bottom of a well. Marika is the queen of the demigods and the lands between. Odin is the king of the 9 realms. Odin can shapeshift, and Marika is closely tied to the Mimic Veil, which is called Marika's Mischief, and can be used to shapeshift. They both impaled themselves with a spear and hung themselves from the World Tree. Odin foresaw that Fenrir was going to kill him during Ragnarok, so he imprisoned the wolf in shackles, which did nothing to stop his death. Queen Marika foresaw that destined death was going to kill her, so she imprisoned the rune of death in Malekith's body, which did nothing to stop the player from killing her during the shattering.
And I wouldn't necessarily agree with the idea that she saw destined death was going to kill her, because that makes it sound a bit more targeted. Although it might not technically be wrong if destined death was going to be the death of everybody, but I digress from that point and want to touch back on the duality, plurality of Marika and Radagon in relation to the mapping that he's done on the characters so far. And even though I am really a big fan of mapping Marika as a character on to Odin, of course we had the whole issue of Radagon's alleged... Oh yeah, so Scum Info was asking about... Scum Mage Info was asking about some of the localization stuff. So one of the other big things in Elden Ring is that the curse that's allegedly placed onto Radagon from the fire giants, Braid? I don't remember. Oh, yeah. Okay, found it. Giant's Red Braid says every giant is red of hair, and Radagon was said to have despised his own red locks. Perhaps that was a curse of their kind. So because it says it's a curse of their kind, it makes it sound as though there is including Radagon into this with the English description. But the Japanese is a little bit more distant with that. And so it says essentially that all of the giants were red of hair. Radagon was said to have despaired at his own red hair. And perhaps that was a curse of the giants. So the way that the Japanese reads is that it's possible that Radagon could have been cursed by the giants rather than Radagon being a giant and whatnot. And Zafe says agreed. Oh yeah, Zafe, I also noticed your pronunciation for your Godwin video is much better than somebody just like reading off a script and not knowing Japanese. So I almost said Kongbu Hasoyo, which is Korean. Anyway, have you studied? And then why was I bringing? Oh yeah. So the whole reason why I was bringing up America as Odin and Radagon again is that obviously with Norse mythology, Thor doesn't like literally belong in the same body as Odin. So this is kind of like one of the parts where the connections fall off, which is part of why I think it's unfortunate to say that Elden Ring story is Norse mythology, even though he did set it up at the very beginning of the video that a lot of this stuff is more figurative rather than what the title may betray. Hokage.
Odin made Yggdrasil from the body of Ymir. America may have made the Erdtree from a pile of bodies in the land of shadow. They both waged war against the giants, which resulted in the extinction of the giants. You can piece together more yourself. But what really concerns me is Queen Marika hung from the Erdtree, but she never woke up. Do you remember the 9th night of Odin's hanging? How Niflheim and Midgard came into each other and fell upon each other, which made two realms become one, which allowed spirits, necromancy, and sorcery to invade Midgard. Well, this ended the morning of the 10th day, when Odin's spirit came back to his body and he awoke, which separated Midgard and Niflheim and prevented spirits, necromancy, and sorcery from coming into Midgard. But I wonder, what would have happened if Odin didn't wake up?
And so I think that idea is very interesting to consider with what we're told about like the Shadow Realm and like the lands between, and with like death kind of being drifting towards the Shadow Realm, but that could have also been the lands between in the past. So right. You got a lot of comments saying speaking another language was cringe, which kind of saddened you. Yeah, I can kind of understand where people are coming from with that. I think, all right, so this is constructive feedback, so, please take it kindly. I try to avoid using Japanese directly that much, except for where it is the most applicable to the points that I'm making, because going into that much depth about the Japanese is only relevant to people who have the understanding for it. So I actually really enjoyed your video because you did go into that much depth, and I was like, okay, yep, I see where he's coming from. But for other people, that might not be as relevant because it's just kind of like word salad, or maybe even a little bit less than word salad because they can't pick out the words. So anyway, I appreciated it. So thank you. I don't know, man. It's pretty rough. Monolingual self-loathing. They're just mad they aren't bilingual. Nah, a lot of people really just don't like hearing other languages. And all right, Teen Sith, you have a good night, and thanks for dropping by as always.
Spirit caller snails which, you guessed it, summon more spirits. There are 2 gods which are currently spirits. There are spirit calling bells, which can be used to summon just about any spirit.
Yeah, it looks like my stream must have died for a second there, which is weird because like the window part had like frozen for a second and said it was disconnected, but everything seemed fine elsewhere. I've got 0 dropped frames on my end from OBS, so that seemed like a YouTube F, about 1 minute dead. All right, did you guys like lose connection? Hold on, how do I phrase this? Like, obviously I am live to myself, but I don't know if I'm like a minute ahead of you guys now, if you're all a minute behind. It died the second I said goodbye to Teen Sith, so we could blame it Teen Sith. All right. All right, so if you guys can hear me, type spirits into chat. I'm back. And then okay, so it looks like we're live enough. Okay, so we are like live. Okay, good. All right, so maybe just some stuff got lost in the sauce there. All right, thank you all. And for the emote, I'm going to back it up then if we lost like a minute. Schmonley. All right, YouTube is failing me now.
To invade
There we go.
Midgard. Well, this ended the morning of the 10th day, when Odin's spirit came back to his body and he awoke, which separated Midgard and Niflheim and prevented spirits, necromancy, and sorcery from coming into Midgard. But I wonder, what would have happened if Odin didn't wake up? I think, logically, that Midgard would still be plagued by spirits, necromancy, and sorcery. And what are the lands between like? Turn anywhere in the lands between, and there is a spirit waiting to tell you something. There are spirit banners from old wars, spirit warriors, spirit caller snails which, you guessed it, summon more spirits. There are 2 gods which are currently spirits. There are spirit calling bells, which can be used to summon just about any spirit. Vengeful spirits, Black Knife Assassin, Puppeteer Tarnished, free rats. I mean, why not? If you have the mind for it, the sky's the limit. And what about necromancy? Revenants, wraiths, mariners, deathbirds, those who live in death.
Oh my, I don't know. Just like the way he's listening to the meta is kind of funny to me. So yeah, I wanted to touch back on what Zafe was saying a moment ago. You just wanted to mainly convey that you're not just Google translating everything. Yeah, that is completely understandable. I know where you're going with that. I think part of it is you just need to either take the L sometimes or just kind of slowly build up your reputation that way. And so, to the people who know enough Japanese, you will definitely have sounded fluent enough to like pass the sniff test. Whereas like for the people who will just dogpile you anyway, they're just going to be haters. So I just wouldn't worry about it too much, to be honest, and just, bring up what is relevant as it's relevant. And for what it's worth, obviously my audience is different than yours, but pretty much every single time that I've asked my audience, like, hey guys, does this make sense? Did I go into enough detail? Do I need to go into more detail? Everyone has always been like, yes, more detail, please. So just keep that in mind as you move forward too.
For God's sakes, there's an entire sorcery set dedicated to necromancy, which was rediscovered recently by a necromancer who we can meet in-game. And of course, who could forget Godwyn, a necromantic undead demigod, who is having a dream of an undead dragon who can be killed, which drops the mending rune of death, which can be used to imbue necromancy into the Elden Ring. And sorcery? Don't even get me started on sorcery. There are 2 dungeons dedicated to sorcery and sorcery students. There are 13 types of sorcery, ranging from casting the primeval current, to shooting magical arrows, to sacrificing a bit of your health to grow a dangerous thorny plant.
All right. I don't mean to like pause the video so much for like trivial stuff, but oh man, I'm gonna be dating myself here. But does anybody know that video of look at that horse? Actually, my producers tell me this isn't a picture of a horse. It may even be a moth. Just like the way he's delivering his lines just kind of reminds me of that infomercial home channel shopping network kind of style. Photo printer. All right.
To summoning great tornadoes of ice. And who could forget Radon, a demigod who is holding an entire galaxy of stars in place with gravity sorcery.
Oh yeah, and I should say this in case Boris ever does come and like watch this video, that I'm not trying to dunk on you, I'm just enjoying this, by the way. It's just kind of what I'm thinking of as I hear it. Does it play DVD? We'll wait and see.
While his
it does have SD card in the actual infomercial.
Of stars in place with gravity sorcery. While his mind is being eaten alive by a disease that infects everything. Spirits, necromancy, and sorcery rule the lands between. They have never been more powerful or more prominent a theme in any FromSoft game, which leads to my predictions. I think that Queen Marika did the exact been more powerful or more prominent a theme in any FromSoft game.
I can kind of see what he means by that, yeah. Especially because like Ronnie ends up being the kind of main heroine, at least. Yeah, I'll let that one slide.
Which leads to my predictions. I think that Queen Marika did the exact same thing Odin did. I think that she sacrificed her body to the Erdtree and abandoned her flesh like Ronnie and Mikkola. I think she traveled to the land of shadow to try and learn how to change her fate and better understand the Elden Ring's runes. I think that this act caused aspects of the land of shadow to spill into the lands between, which allowed spirits, necromancy, and sorcery to become as powerful as they are.
And for anybody who may have joined the stream in late, this was a prediction for the DLC stuff because we didn't know anything at that time, so just keep that in mind for this section specifically.
However, I think that when Queen Marika's spirit tried to re-enter her body, something stopped her, which prevented the Age of the Shattering from ending. There are two other demigods in the Land of Shadow. Why don't we talk about them? Mikkola is a strange case. Mikkola is a demigod. He has blonde hair and feminine features, which makes people mistake him as a woman. His sister Melania states that Mikkola has the wisdom, the allure of a god, and he is stuck in perpetual youth, which makes him appear like a child. He is the most beloved demigod, but he's also been known to compel affection in unnatural ways, through magic. Mikkola was captured by Mohg, Lord of Blood, who wished to make him his consort. He is associated with Amber through the Amber and the Mikkola Knight Sword and the Amber Starlight Shard. The Amber Starlight Shard is found in front of Mikkola's statue.
And Cohiba asks, wasn't it said from the get-go that the Shadowlands are a section of the Lands Between that got physically disconnected from the main world? Yes. Unfortunately, it was only in an interview, though, which this is kind of one of the things that does bother me a lot about the storytelling in FromSoft games, that some of the most critical pieces of information about what's going on in the games doesn't come from the game itself and has to come from secondary sources, which it's kind of garbage, to be honest. I mean, don't get me wrong, like certainly there's going to be some like some cases where that happens in literature, like if you ask Tolkien, why didn't they just take the griffins to Mordor? Like that's a bit of a different thing to me than learning that the Land of Shadow used to be part of the Lands Between. Now, obviously, we do have a couple hints of that within the DLC itself, but I think for most people who don't delve extremely deeply into the lore or even like read the interviews, they might not come to that understanding of the game, which of course not everything needs to be spelled out so bluntly, but this could have done with a little bit more explaining, I think. And then Stowboat asks, how disconnected? By shifting reality or by hiding from sight? You thought it was the latter. It is left ambiguous, and it could be a little bit of both. You'd forgotten that was from an interview? Yeah. Zafe says both as well. Yeah, Pixie says we have the suppression pillar. Yeah, and that's about it, really. That, and of course, we do have like the dueling stuff, but the Carians, I guess, but it's all arguable, especially depending on how one thinks these people arrived in the lands of Shadow. And then Global Sequence thinks the sealing of a near limb might give us a hint as to how it's done. And this is one thing that I've been complaining a lot about, because we don't have a canon time for when we actually access the DLC. Because in some ways, it makes a ton of sense to me that it should canonically happen after we've burned the Erdtree. But at the very least, Mikola calls us the Lord of the Old Order, so maybe it's post-game stuff. So of course the Erdtree should already be burned then, but that doesn't really map on super well to my playthrough where I went into the DLC before killing the fire giant. So, rip me. And then Pixie still doesn't know if the Land of Shadow is a realm of dead or something. It's arguable, so like, it might have been that when the Land of Shadow was part of the Lands Between, it was like a locus point for death to drift toward. And it may have just been because like Tibia Mariners or Gravekeepers or whatnot was guiding death to a specific spot. Maybe it was just like a natural aspect of the Lands Between. We don't really know. Or maybe once America sealed away destined death in Malekith and whatnot, that death was relegated to drift more toward the realm of Shadow if it wasn't integrated into the roots of the Erdtree. So Shupa says, you think he says aspiring Lord of the Old Order. Funny thing is, this ties into one of those localization things where I was talking about it on stream earlier tonight, and I'm not like blaming you or anything. So let me pull up my spreadsheet. And Zafe, if you're in chat and if you know about this, that's cool. And if you don't, I'm sure you'll get a kick out of this as well. Where you have aspiring here, you don't really have any equivalent of that here. So this is Old Order. So like one who would be the Lord of the Old Order. So maybe saying would be isn't the right way to say this. Like, the one who is the Lord of the Old Order is kind of what he's saying, rather than aspiring. Actually, let me look at the... Yeah, there's no additional context to make it work that way. So, even though he calls us aspiring Lord of the Old Order, even in this quote, in the other part of his grab attacks, he just calls us the Lord of the Old Order as well. Hold on. I have footage of it if I actually needed it. Okay, yeah. So, Lord of the Old Order, right here. Let us go together. Come now, let us go together. So. Hooray, continuity. The game does say and literally shows the Shadowlands are/got veiled, but in a game like this, it's not unreasonable that folk would read this differently. Well, we're not actually shown when or how the land was sealed, other than the story trailer, which is technically still not part of the game. And one of the issues with the story trailer that we've been having is that it's arguable even in the timeline of events when that happened. All right, so having said all that, let's dive back into the video.
In a crevice that looks like this, Mikola created and then taught his father Radagon Golden Order fundamentalist incantations, before eventually abandoning his studies to focus on understanding unalloyed gold. Miquella grew the Halig tree from parts of his body, which, as we can see, has pink leaves or pink flowers on it. In the DLC announcement photo, we can see that Miquella rode through a meadow. Additionally, in the DLC trailer, we can see that Miquella is being followed by a group of people, and this one looks like a woman. In the game's cut content, it is revealed that Miquella is the holder of the Rune of Abundance, and Miquella has a spiritual counterpart called Saint Trina. Miquella does a lot, and not a lot of it interconnects very well. He is an extremely complex character in Elden Ring, so it was extremely hard for me to find an exact pinpoint Norse counterpart. So I broadened my horizons and concluded that Miquella takes after Freya. Freya is my favorite mythological deity, as she is not only a well-discussed Norse god, but also a highly respected Germanic and pagan god. Because of this, she is an extremely complex figure. Freya is a Vanir god, who lives with the Aesir gods in Norse mythology. She is the most beautiful goddess, with long golden hair. Freya is the god of love, witchcraft, magic, gold, fertility, spirituality, and war. The Germanic people believe she was also the god of abundant life, the personification of purifying gold, and a god of death in an unusual sense. Freya is widely loved by gods, giants, and humanity itself. The giants really love Freya though, and there are many stories of the giants kidnapping Freya to try and marry her because they simply love her so much. When Freya cries...
Which, this is funny, because when you consider the context of the DLC and whatnot, and the kind of duality between Marika and Radagon, maybe there is this kind of duality present between Freya and Odin and Marika and Radagon. So... I guess like Radagon, it doesn't really fit super well onto either of these characters, but they just kind of both work for Marika. So Glow-Eyed Queen Marika and then Queen Marika. Anyway, I'm joking.
She sheds tears of gold and amber. Freya, as a pagan god, is worshipped by women. There are pagan cults dedicated to the study of Freya. Freya is also a powerful sorcerer, and she teaches these sorceries to Odin. The Germanic people also believe that Freya is as beautiful as she is because Odin burned away all her impurities, like gold being distilled and reforged, which is kind of like unalloyed gold, pure gold. As a ruler of the dead, the Germanic also believed that her wisdom was only second to Odin, as the dead were the source for most stories, spells, and knowledge in the world, and Freya could communicate with them directly.
So, Zafe was on a delay, but he said it's really weird they added in aspiring to Miquella's line. Well, for what it's worth, there's probably a lot more leeway given when they're doing the voice directions for the lines as well as the scripts, because we're told from multiple sources that Miyazaki has a really personal role in the hiring of the voice actors and the way they've delivered their lines, and that they seem to be adjusting things a bit on the fly as they get delivered. So I am a little bit curious as to how that works sometimes, whether they just have a Japanese script and whether it gets updated based off of what the voice actors say, or if a little bit gets lost in the sauce, either from the English VAs just digressing from what was on the beaten path, or if they delivered their lines and then the Japanese was altered later to go more in line with what Miyazaki was thinking. And then we also have the added ambiguity of, does Miyazaki really care too much about what is actually literally said in the English, or is it just that he's hired English voice actors to provide a form of exoticism to like a core Japanese audience, since they tend to focus more on Japanese games and gamers rather than trying to appeal to like a broader global mass market. But of course, I'm sure they keep that stuff in mind. I mean, it's a company, you know, they're trying to make money. So I do have a lot of questions about that myself. Your main take is it just sounds a bit cooler, and I think that could have been it as well. And that is kind of like the thing that I do turn back to quite a bit when analyzing the lore and the imagery of these games: the rule of cool. And then Pixie read a paper on the translations in Dark Souls. The voice lines are given in Japanese, updated to English to make it flow better, then translated back to Japanese. But as versions of the game changes, sometimes the Japanese subtitles get out of sync. And yeah, there are definitely a lot of bits of linguistic evidence about the scripts kind of getting updated over time. I think Bloodborne might stand out the most in that regard. But I'm obviously a lot more familiar with Bloodborne than like the Dark Souls trilogy. And it's also a lot easier to look at one game. Actually, I don't really think I've looked at the Korean for the Dark Souls stuff. So yeah, maybe there were just as many issues with like updates in the Dark Souls trilogy. Anyway, kind of getting off topic there. And then, Ayana, nice to see you again. You said, Freya is a twin sister of Freyr, and apparently some scholars think they might be the same. You might be misremembering. I don't remember that. I think I've only ever heard of Freya on her own. Don't tell you I know Korean as well. Chogum. I used to know Korean a lot better, but now I don't. I haven't used it in too long. Me and Hamnida.
Additionally, the Germanics say that Freya actually saw the runes of Ragnarok before Odin did, but because she did not make the necessary sacrifices, she was unable to translate them. Freya is associated with myrtle trees, which are trees with pink flowers, and people sacrifice to Freya for abundant harvest and increased fertility. But the Germanic people also feared that Freya had a wicked side, and I quote, "In the necromantic form, she has a greed for wealth and can kill by magic. She is an entrapping goddess. Better to stay with her side of lust and love." Let's compare. Both Freya and Mikkola have blonde hair and feminine features. Mikkola and Freya are both gods of love and have methods of compelling love unnaturally. They are both kidnapped by other gods for the purpose of marriage. They are both closely associated with amber and pure or unalloyed gold. They are both sorcerers who taught other gods sorceries. They both have ties to abundance. Mikkola is clearly, or called, the wisest and strongest demigod by millennia, and Freya is called wise and strong by the Germanic and pagan peoples. They are both closely associated with trees that have pink flowers and leaves. They are both followed by women, and I will touch on why I think that all of Mikkola's followers are women. Lilies are a symbol of rebirth and fertility, and Freya's symbols are those of rebirth and fertility. Both gods have an evil counterpart. Mikkola has Saint Trina, and Freya has her necromantic form. And I was going to stop there. I thought there was nothing more to discuss. But after doing more research, I realized I mistake something. Freya isn't a god of magic. She's the god of Seidr magic. And this completely changed the way I thought about Elden Ring. In Norse mythology, Seidr is just another type of magic that allows future sight through unspecified means. But in pagan text, Seidr is a magical practice of disconnecting the soul from the body to visit the spirit realm, which allows you to communicate with the dead and see the future. Disconnecting the soul requires the body to undergo one of three things. 1. You must have powerful dreaming. 2. You must have hallucinations or visions. Or 3. You must bring the body close to death. If one of these are met, the spirit is disconnected from the body, and the disconnected living spirit can freely enter the land of the dead if one or more requirement is met. 1. You attend with spirit animal who can move freely between both worlds. 2. You bring mistletoe, which symbolizes death. 3. You self-inflict an injury as a sacrifice. Or 4. You carry the branch of a red sapped tree. However,
So, right. Obviously, a lot of this kind of is him shooting himself in the foot a little bit because of like the DLC by inadvertently predicting that Mikkela's followers were all women, but I can forgive that because it was pre-DLC, even though I think it was pretty obvious some of the characters are going to be male, especially with like the voice lines. But anyway, moving on from that, I forgot to say hello to Stella. Maybe she joined in with the oh, you just got here. Okay, cool. So welcome in, Stella. Nice to see you again. And then somebody was laughing at me saying sorry with a redneck accent. There's a bit of a story to that, actually, in that when I was first learning Korean, they showed us this video of other people who were trying to learn Korean, and like they had a group presentation, and like this is part of like the video that was made, and there was this dude who had one of the thickest Southern accents that I've ever heard. And so when they were like getting to the end of the skit, he just goes, "Ayan Yong Hee K-Ship Show." And so sometimes when I like speak Korean, I just kind of think of just how over the top and ridiculous it was and just do it. I also do that when I'm just like screwing around with myself like Japanese. It's just kind of fun to talk in a foreign language with an accent, which is just completely incongruous with what one would expect. So anyway, just to bring up another parallel story, I also knew another dude who had an extremely thick accent who's trying to learn to speak Chinese like a tonal language, and he was struggling. We can just say that much.
However, the requirements can be totally ignored under special conditions. Special women, called the Daughters of Freya, who follow Freya as a religion, can enter the afterlife freely because Freya self-inflicted an injury and met the requirement for them. Also, Freya is the ruler of Asgard, so she can enter the afterlife freely. So there are 6 total requirements. Regardless, if I am right, then I can make some huge predictions about the DLC. First, the Land of Shadow is a mixture of Asgard and Niflheim, and it is under the lands between.
And I do kind of unironically think it's a strong possibility that the Land of Shadow could be under the lands between, but alright.
Second, Melna, Rani, Mikkela, and Queen Marika have all entered the Land of Shadows using Sather magic. Third, Mikkela
Arguable.
purposely or accidentally taught Rani and Queen Marika Sather magic. 4. Tree spirits are in the lands between because of the Erdtree's burning. And maybe 5th.
Actually, why did I always forget that ulcerated tree spirits being in the lands of shadow could tie into the point of number 1 of like the Erdtree's roots extending that far?
Mesmer is Surtur and Hel. Let me explain. So from what little we know of the Land of Shadow, it is composed of a few different areas. There are sprawling fields, there's a forest, which is behind a gravity bore, and there are these large castles. These all point to the Land of Shadow being based on Asgard. Asgard is described as a beautiful afterlife, with lush green grass, tall trees, littered with castles and halls to dine in, which are supplied food from meadows of grain. Asgard is also the afterlife for warriors exclusively, and in the Lands of Shadow, we can see all 3. Also, the fields in Asgard are called Folkvangar, and Freya is the ruler of Folkvangar. We can see Mikkela riding in this field, which is probably a reference to Freya. But the Lands of Shadow also have dark elements. There are these swamps of toxins with abominations in them. There are areas covered in thick mist and fog, deep caverns which house necromantic beings. That definitely isn't Asgard, but it does sound like the other afterlife, Niflheim. Niflheim roughly translates to Mist Realm or Fog Realm. It is a dark, cold, and misty, foggy dimension, home to hideous creatures and the bodies of those who died weak. The Germanic people also believed that there were 11 poisonous rivers in Niflheim, So all of these environments look like they could be from Niflheim. Within
So yeah, I was curious to see if you were going to reconcile the idea of Asgard with Niflheim both being in the Land of Shadow, because it seemed as though you've got two conflicting realms occupying the same spot. And despite all that, I can kind of see how it can still map into even the current form of the DLC, with perhaps like Anir Elim being more akin to Niflheim, and Midra's Manse and whatnot, the Fishwere being more like Niflheim. Did I say Niflheim for this? I meant Asgard. But anyway.
Niflheim. So all of these environments look like they could be from Niflheim. Within Niflheim lies the kingdom of Hel, ruled by Hel, which is a freezing cold area covered in fog and home to the frost giants. Within Hel, there is a place called Nostrand, also known as the Corpse Shore. Nostrand is described as a long hallway, which leads to a doorway that faces north. The hallway is surrounded by dead bodies of murderers, oathbreakers, traitors, and adulterers. Yggdrasil's roots grow into Nostrand as Nostrand's giant piles of bodies feed it. These piles of bodies are also miles high, and they are home to a great serpent known as Nidhogg. Are you seeing this? The long hallway. The doorway which faces north, where a north wind could blow in. The giant piles of bodies. It is nearly a one-to-one description. But how can the Land of Shadow be both Asgard and Niflheim? Well, the pagans have an answer for us. The pagans believe that there was only one afterlife. They thought that those who died in battle went to the light side of the afterlife, and those who died cowards went to the dark side. The light side is Asgard, and the dark side is Niflheim. And the pagans believed that death was rebirth. You didn't die and become a spirit, you die and reincarnated in the afterlife, which would explain why other species exist in the Land of Shadow. It's not just a land of spirits, but also a land of living beings. I also think that the Land of Shadow is underneath the lands between, because the pagans believed that Odin grew Yggdrasil. Odin grew Yggdrasil from the body of Ymir, the largest giant, and he grew it between Niflheim and Muspelheim. As Yggdrasil grew, the other realms were created on the branches of Yggdrasil. In this example, we have Midgard and we have Jotunheim, the land of the giants. These two are also specifically placed as traditionally Jotunheim is higher on the tree than Midgard.
And in some ways, this can kind of correlate to the Siluria tree Crucible Knight armor set, in that like the branches could be like the very top part, and the body could be the trunk, and this could be, I wouldn't say like this would be like the lands between, or maybe it is anyway. And then the bottom with the spiral roots could go back down to the bottom realms. Now that I think about it, and I'll get to your guys' question in a moment. Do I have a picture of Siluria? That'd be nice. I should take one if I haven't. Just the tree. Damn it. I need like a front shot of Siluria sometime. So I guess we're just gonna have to stick with footage. So unfortunately, I don't know if I can just like flip this upside down in VLC, but I was thinking, what if, I guess it doesn't map onto it super well. I was wondering like if you flip this upside down, or like let's say that this part represents the Erdtree, and then if we like say like this is like the equator or whatnot, and then we went and turned ourselves upside down, could this represent the shadow tree and its winding roots around the Erdtree? Obviously, it doesn't work super well because these are both winding around each other, as opposed to like one being like tilted and whatnot. So, anyway, just thinking aloud here. So, it does, and like some of this stuff could tie back into that depiction of the Elden Ring and the Erdtree on the Erdtree door. So, going back to chat, you guys are asking about Ansbach's dialogue if he dies in the Radahn fight. And apparently he says, "Righteous tarnished to become our new lord, a lord not for gods, but for men." So this is pretty much perfectly fine. Yeah. So as far as the term Lord is concerned, it is consistent with the way that the Lord in Elden Lord is used, like Ol, as opposed to the way that he refers to Lord Mohg as his Autogi, his like master. And he makes it sound as though we're not a lord yet, but Miquella makes it sound as though we are a lord. And then there's enough ambiguity with the way that lord is used with like box dialogue or things like that, where even if they're calling us a lord, it's a little bit ambiguous as to whether or not they mean Elden Lord or their sovereign, I guess, could be one way of saying that. That's what Captini thought when you saw the tree symbolism with the lands of shadow. Okay, let's go back to the video here. You'd say Lord is a safe bet. Yeah. So, Elden Ring does handle that a lot better than like Dark Souls did, where they use like Lord and King kind of interchangeably and made it a bit more hard to parse sometimes as a result of that.
So if the lands of shadow are where the Erdtree were born, then it needs to be under the lands between. Also, Queen Marika is Numen. The Numen runes can be found underground, and the Numen people are extremely closely associated with the Nox people, which are night people who live underground. So maybe Queen Marika and the Numen made a journey to the surface.
You know, as much as I've complained about the Nox, I guess I never even really complained about the lack of the legitimate night folk, the dudes who came up with the Urumi whip weapon thing. Just because, I don't know, they were just kind of always a meme even in the base game, and they were forgotten even in the realm of shadow. They're like the furtive pygmy, but worse.
From the Lake of Rods, to Noxtella, to the Deep Root Depths, to Siofra River, to Nokron, and finally up into Limgrave, where they made a pilgrimage into Leyndell, and eventually traveled to the Giant's Peak, and waged war with the Giants. This would validate tarnished archaeologists' theory of the underground Erdtree cult, but that's foggy speculation at best.
And I don't really like that because of the way that the churches are ordinally numbered, with the first Church of America being closer to the Fire Giant's place and then coming back down. But regardless of that, we are told that the forces of Leyndell, or like the Erdtree at least, did like climb up the Fire Giant mountain. So I'm not trying to say that they didn't like have to travel to reach it. I'm just saying like I don't really know how I feel about this kind of explanation for it.
Speaking of fog, Niflheim roughly translates to realm of fog or realm of mist, which reminded me of these two, Melina and Ranni. When we first meet both of these characters, they appear out of nowhere, surrounded by fog. Melina is burned and bodiless, and Ranni shed her flesh, so they are both spirits. And when I realized that, another thing clicked. Melina, Ranni, Marika, and Miquella all meet a requirement to complete a Seidr ritual. Melina is burned and bodiless. That's a self-inflicted injury. Ranni had the curse mark of death carved into her body, which is thematically...
I think the way that he said that was a little bit clumsy, but he is right that she does inflict a wound on herself later on, but that doesn't necessarily arise from that premise the way that it was presented.
the same as mistletoe in Elden Ring because of Godwin's relation to Baldur. Queen Marika not only hung herself, but the pagans believed that the spear in Odin's body was a branch of Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil was a red ash tree, so he was carrying the branch of a red sap tree. And the spear in Marika is bright red and looks like wood. Mikkola is Freya, so he can come and go to the land of shadows as he pleases. And then there's the band of people following Mikkola, who are clearly a reference to the daughters of Freya, so they can enter the lands of
Clearly.
shadow because Mikkola made a sacrifice for them. Although, that does mean all of them would have to be girls, and I don't know if some of these are girls. Yeah,
Okay, so he does walk it back a little bit.
it's up in the air. And this also doesn't explain how we enter the land of shadow. We aren't always female, so we can't be Mikkola's followers. We didn't self-inflict a wound, or bring mistletoe, or bring red sapwood. But we did bring Torrent, the spectral steed, who can travel to the lands between and the lands of shadow at will. And that is it. All 6 say the requirements demonstrated in Elden Ring. And now you may be wondering,
I do like that idea of potentially using torrents to access the realm of shadow, so it's a little bit unfortunate we didn't get anything like that, I guess.
how did Marika and Ranni learn Seidr magic? Seidr is a practice usually only taught to women, and their Norse counterparts are both men, so it'd be untraditional for them to know Seidr. Well, remember how I said that Freya taught Odin magic? Well, the specific type of magic she taught Odin was Seidr magic. That's why Odin is sometimes called feminine, because he practices a magic only taught to women. Additionally, there is a poem that states that Loki disguised himself as another god to spy on Freya teaching Odin magic. So
Now that I think about it, it is kind of interesting that we don't really have the kind of gendered form of magic or magic masters in Elden Ring that was customary from like Demon Souls to Dark Souls with Yuria and Carla and whatnot, or even like Quelana.
So I think that Marika learned Seidr magic from Mikkola, and that Ranni learned it indirectly by eavesdropping on the two. I don't know about Melna, but judging by the fact that she knows Marika's old spoken speeches, maybe Marika and Melna were close, and Marika just taught her Seidr magic. Or maybe
And so this might come back to how he shot himself in the foot by putting Thor coded for Radagon, because we are told that Mikkola and Radagon kind of taught each other incantations, so that could have been one way to potentially strengthen this idea in his comparative analysis. But of course, even if he did that, that doesn't mean it would have been like foolproof, because we still have like a lot of issues of arguing just how well all of this stuff maps on together with Elden Ring to begin with. So anyway,
she translated the Seidr practices from spoken echoes. Either way, I don't know for sure. But I do know who this is. Nidhogg is a dragon/serpent like Smaug and Jormungandr, which you guys can figure out this relation on your own. Nidhogg lives in the corpse
Okay.
of Strand, in Yggdrasil's roots. It eats the roots of Yggdrasil and feasts on blood from the corpse shore. But during Ragnarok, it leaves and resurfaces in Midgard. Surtur destroys Asgard and burns Yggdrasil. In Midgard, it feasts on men who are panicked by Ragnarok and eats bits of the tree. After Ragnarok ends, Nidhogg returns to Niflheim, and it's an odd story, but what concerns me is that Nidhogg looks exactly like the tree spirits. They're both missing their back limbs, they both have giant gaping mouths, long tails, and look like wingless dragons. The tree spirits breathe holy flame, the same way that Placidusax does, which demonstrates that the tree spirits have draconic aspects to them. Additionally, you find...
So now that we're talking about snakes and whatnot, and since we had mentioned Mesmer way early, I think on Scummage Infa's video, or maybe it's just in the Discord earlier today, I can't remember. No, we definitely did talk about it in the Discord. Yeah, it might have just been a Discord only thing. So, anyway, long story short, for anybody in the chat who might not know, in the Fire Knight armor, the Japanese. Wait, what's it say in English? Let's pull it up. Okay. Yeah, I see. Oh, wow, that's kind of weird. All right, so the English says. I guess I'll just read the whole thing. Armor of the Fire Knights under Mesmer the Impaler's personal command. Distinguished by its red cape and twin golden snakes which adorn the neck, enhancing incantations of Mesmer's flame. These were the only ones who truly knew Mesmer, his flames like serpents, the painful fate that accompanied his accursed form. So, as far as saying his flames like serpents, that's not exactly what the Japanese says. So, it says they were the only ones who understood Mesmer or knew Mesmer, and this is kind of like a fragment, but it's just saying that they knew Mesmer, that he was a fire snake. They knew of Mesmer being a fire snake, essentially, and also the pain or the agony of being a snake. So, Mesmer equals fire snake, rather than his flames being like serpents, which is a pretty big difference, surprisingly enough. So, why did I bring that up? Oh, yeah. So, we were talking about Mesmer and why he is a snake, because it does seem to kind of come out of nowhere, but maybe it's worth reconsidering just how snake-like the ulcerated tree spirits are compared to the snake-like form of Mesmer. Now I'm wondering whether or not the ulcerated tree spirits were competing with the Erdtree for growth, and part of the reason the duelists of the Colosseum fought against snakes is because they didn't want other Erdtrees to win out. It's a neat idea. There's a part of me that likes it, but a big part of me that also dislikes it, just because it's kind of messy with all of that other stuff pertaining to the Erdtree and whatnot. So, anyway, moving on from that.
And tree spirits underground by Erdtree roots, just like where you find Needhorg. I'm predicting that we will see more tree spirits in the DLC, since the DLC is going to be like Niflheim, so there should be more Needhorgs down there. But what I said isn't entirely true. Sometimes tree spirits are found on land. There are 3 tree spirits that resurface at the Ashen Capital. There's one that can be found at the Volcano Manor, and there are 2 that can be found around Lane Dell. The 3 that appear after we burn the Erdtree make sense, as burning the Erdtree is the same as burning Yggdrasil. The one at the Volcano Manor makes sense, as it's in front of a burned minor Erdtree, which is similar to Yggdrasil. But these 2 by the capital are not by any burnt trees. So what
It doesn't necessarily have to be a burned tree, but
gives? Well, if we look closer in Langdell, we can see residual piles of ash, which indicate that the Erdtree was burned once before, a long time ago. So who burned the Erdtree first? Yep, finally made it to Mesmer. I think Mesmer is Surtur. Surtur lives in the primordial fire realm Muspelheim, which is covered in volcanoes and lava. During Ragnarok, Surtur destroys Asgard and accidentally burns Yggdrasil. We can see that Mesmer is burning the Land of Shadow, which would be the same as burning Asgard, just like Surtur. Additionally, the pictures in the Volcano Manor depict that the Erdtree was burned once before, behind Reichart's throne in the Volcano Manor.
and this picture has kind of stuck on my mind for a very long time, and the only way that I could meaningfully reconcile it for a lot of other things would be that this would be an artist's rendition of Reichart's Ultimate Vision as opposed to an historic event.
We can see a 2-headed snake tapestry, which looks exactly like Mesmer's 2-headed snake. In the same room, we find pillars.
And I would disagree with that because the snakes here are green and Mesmer's are clearly red. So that's just a little bit of a cherry-picked data point, I think.
Which look very similar to the spiral pillars outside the castle in the Land of Shadow, which makes it similar to Land of Shadow architecture. Therefore, I think that Mesmer arrived in the Lands of Shadow with Queen Marika. I think he came to the surface and was the original inhabitant of the Volcano Manor, and some time ago, he burned the Erdtree. I think this caused Queen Marika to banish Mesmer and his army into the Land of Shadow, using Sather magic. This is just like how Odin banished Hel into Niflheim.
And I really don't blame him to coming to this kind of prediction, especially before the DLC released. I definitely thought that something like that was a good possibility, and I was a little bit surprised at how much of a mama's boy Mesmer ended up being. And Zafe can't help but wonder if it ties back to Fire's Deadly Sin, the spell found in Dominula. Right, and I've been talking a lot about this on stream lately. I don't think you were here yesterday unless you were lurking, and I do unironically wonder if Mesmer helped burn the Erdtree between Marika and Godfrey's reign to go into Radagon's reign and helped her ascend him to lordship, and if his kindling is actually with the first cardinal sin of the Erdtree. And actually, Zafe, this might also be worth getting your opinion on. What was the kindling. Wait, was it the kindling? No, it's the remembrance. Not to put you on the spot or anything. And I'll type it into chat so that way you don't have to wait for me on screen. Wait, is this it? No, this is the spear. Okay, so I'm going to give you the middle and bottom lines of the text for the Nihongo no description of the remembrance there. So it's in the chat in case I go too fast here. So Starfish on the Discord brought up a good point that the final line and the Hajimari no Sumi, the first sin, might tie into being hidden in the Shadowland rather than being with Mesmer himself, which kind of makes a lot of sense to me. And so my initial interpretation of these lines is that the original sin and the hatred was actually confined within Mesmer himself, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And when I re-looked at the Japanese, I was like, okay, yeah, if you ignore the line break and just take it as a kind of continuous thought that Mesmer was hidden along with the unforgettable hatred and the cardinal sin, then I think there is a little bit more distance between him and that sin itself should just be confined within the realm of shadow. So that might be worth considering, because I did not consider that second interpretation when I first read it. And you said it's ambiguous. All right. Pixie says, Mesmer's fire burned things to the soul. The Erdtree still has its spiritual form left, but a lot of the corporeal form seems damaged. Thinking about that. And hey, Hilko, welcome back in. You happy we watched Scum Mage's thing? All right. So, all right, we've only got 2 minutes left of this. Let's go ahead and finish it up.
And I think that Mesmer became a cruel, evil, greedy god of death, just like how Hel became a cruel, evil, greedy god of death. But aside from Norse mythology, I think that Mesmer is a foil to Horaloo. I think that Mesmer fought wars with Queen Marika, just like Horaloo. And when a time of peace came to the lands between, both warriors were given a choice: put down the sword or face punishment. Horaloo took Sarash upon his back and became Godfrey, which allowed him to become the first Elden Lord. But Mesmer refused to stop waging wars. Marika could not extinguish his flame of ambition, so she was forced to banish him to the Land of Shadows.
So Morgoth thought we were a Mesmer. Got it.
to protect the lands between, and now Mesmer is the uncrowned king of the Land of Shadows. In conclusion, I think that Radagon is Thor, Rani is Loki, Queen Marika is Odin, Mikula is Freya, the tree spirits are Nidhogg, and Mesmer is a mixture of Surtur and Hel, while also being the foil of Hoarah-Loux. I think the Shattering is Ragnarok, but it never ended because of Queen Marika's Sather practice. I think that the Land of Shadow is underneath the lands between, and I fully expect to fight more spirits, necromancers, sorcerers, and tree spirits in the Land of Shadow. Elden Ring is by far my favorite game. I have dumped a disgusting amount of time into this game, building characters, reading item descriptions, and trying to understand it. I am incredibly grateful that I was able to make this connection to Norse mythology, and I cannot wait to revisit this theory. If you like any part of this theory in particular, please leave a comment letting me know. I will read all of them. Huge thank you to Smotown, Tarnished Archaeologist, and Last Protagonist. Although I have not spoken with any of them directly, their videos help me understand the game and discover these connections. They also inspired me to make this video, so make sure to check them out. Full script and presentation are in the video description, so you can skim through if you missed anything. And with that out the way, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.
Alright, cool. So, I have not heard of their channel before. Damn, only 133 views in 2 months. Doesn't have any content. Bullcrap. I just watched its content. Okay. It's annoying how YouTube's like that. So that's unfortunate. Yeah, depending if they had more content, I was going to consider subscribing to see what all else it was about. Because obviously I feel like going so heavily into the Norse aspect of things didn't do him the most favors it could have. So I am on the fence on whether or not I want to actually like it. And this isn't me saying that I dislike it, but I do want to, you know, kind of have a meaningful distinction between like stuff that I'm like, oh yeah, definitely this is a thumbs up thing versus not. And I think it's just a little bit of the presentation of putting it so strongly kind of turns me away a little bit. So let's see his disclaimer again, and then I might like rethink it.
I have a question
And Stoutboat says, it's not the most unhinged theory, at least. True.
for you. What do Thor, Odin,
All right.
Norse
what I get.
gods? You are wrong. They're all characters in Elden Ring. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, ladies and gentlemen of the Elden Ring community. My name is Gabriel, and through reading item descriptions, analyzing appearances, and making illogical jumps to conclusion, I now believe that Elden Ring's story is Norse mythology.
He does set it up as I believe, so I can kind of forgive that. But I don't want to. I don't know. Yeah. I'll say that it is close for me liking it. I do like some of the parallels, but it's just unfortunate how much just doesn't work out, and it's just kind of like got a lot of the issues that I have with some of the alchemy stuff. So I think to try to stay true to myself, I'm just going to leave it as a bit of a neutral thing. So anyway, I have already gone ahead and shared that in with the chat. If you guys want to counteract me not liking it, or give him a like and or a sub, or even one of those comments that he was asking for, you can tell him that I was a big meanie face to him, even though he shouted me out at the end of the video. And then, yeah, Stella says, having the hindsight of knowing what does actually happen doesn't help. True story. But, I mean, I'm not trying to take that too far. I just think even at the beginning, he was just a little bit gotten by the Thor/Radagon fire giant connection. That certainly didn't help out his case. So I can't really blame him for that, to be fair, but I guess I kind of am, huh? I guess I'm not being fair. Sucks to suck. All right. So Cohiba asked, how incorporeal can the Erdtree be? When it burns, the entire capital is buried under ash. It looks very corporeal. And that has always been one of my biggest pieces of evidence to suggest that the Erdtree is not incorporeal, or at least not completely incorporeal, or that if it is incorporeal, it's more of like a metaphysical object in that it can be burned, and from the burned remnants of the Erdtree, you get like physical ash, which suggests that it's not just like a spirit. Elden has heard and theorized more unhinged stuff, but have you shared it with everyone? And if you have, I mean, to be fair, you know that I've also been highly critical of you, so this isn't like out of character for me. But okay, everybody. I'm not sure what we'll watch tomorrow. I'll need to figure it out. Kind of as always, I've not been on the ball very much for organizing my playlist and whatnot. But anyway, we will be going live at the usual time of 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So hopefully we'll catch you all on the next one. So until then, take care, stay safe. Last Protagonist out.